This is Audible.
Golans presents The Slow Regard of Silent Things, a Kingkiller Chronicle novella by Patrick Rothfuss, read by Rupert Degas. Far below bottom of things. When Auri woke, she knew that she had 7 days. Yes, she was quite sure of it. He would come for a visit on the 7th day. A long time. Long for waiting. But not so long for everything that needed to be done. Not if she were careful. Not if she wanted to be ready. Opening her eyes, Auri saw a whisper of joy, a rare thing as she was tucked tidily away in private. It was a white day then, a deep, a finding day. She smiled, excitement fizzing her chest. There was just enough light to see the veiled shape of her arm as her fingers found the dropper bottle on her bedsheet. She unscrewed it and let a single drip fall into Foxen's dish. After a moment, he slowly brightened into a faint, gloaming blue. Moving carefully, Auri pushed back her blanket so it wouldn't touch the floor. She slipped out of bed, the stone floor warm beneath her feet. Her basin rested on the table near her bed, next to a sliver of her sweetest soap. None of it had changed in the night. That was good. Auri squeezed another drop directly onto Foxen. She hesitated, then grinned, and let a third drop fall. No half measures on a finding day. She gathered up her blanket then, folding and folding it up, carefully tucking it under her chin to keep it from brushing against the floor. Foxen's light continued to swell. First the merest flickering, a fleck, a distant star. Then more of him began to iridesce, a firefly's work. Still more, his brightness grew till he was all over tremulant with shine. Then he sat proudly in his dish, looking like a blue-green ember slightly larger than a coin. She smiled at him while he roused himself the rest of the way, and he filled all of Mantle with his truest, brightest blue-white light. Then Auri looked around. She saw her perfect bed. Just her size. Just so. She checked her sitting chair, her cedar box, her tiny silver cup. The fireplace was empty, and above that was the mantelpiece, her yellow leaf, her box of stone, her grey glass jar with sweet dried lavender inside. Nothing was nothing else. Nothing was anything it shouldn't be. There were 3 ways out of Mantle. There was a hallway, and a doorway, and a door. The last of these was not for her. Auri took the doorway into port. Foxen was still resting in his dish, so his light was dimmer here, but it was still bright enough to see. Port had not been very busy of late, but even so, Auri checked on everything in turn. In the wine rack rested half a broken plate of porcelain, no thicker than the petal of a flower. Below that was a leather octavo book, a pair of corks, a tiny ball of twine. Off to one side, his fine white teacup waited for him, with a patience Auri envied. On the wall shelf sat a blob of yellow resin in a dish, a black rock, A grey stone, a smooth, flat piece of wood. Apart from all the rest, a tiny bottle stood, its wire bail open like a hungry bird. On the central table, a handful of holly berries rested on a clean white cloth. Auri eyed them for a moment, then took them to the bookshelf, a perch they were more suited to. She looked around the room and nodded to herself. All good. Back in mantle, Auri washed her face and hands and feet. She slipped out of her nightshirt and folded it into her cedar box. She stretched happily, lifting up her arms and rolling high onto her toes. Then she ducked into her favorite dress, the one he'd given her. It was sweet against her skin. Her name was burning like a fire inside her. Today was going to be a busy day. Auri gathered up Foxen, carrying him cupped in the palm of her hand. She made her way through port, slipping through a jagged crack in the wall. It was not a wide crack, but Auri was so slight she barely needed turn her shoulders to brushing up against the broken stone. It was nothing like a tight fit. Van was a tall room with straight white walls of fitted stone. It was an echo-empty place, save for her standing mirror. But today there was one other thing, the gentlest breath of sunlight. It snuck in through the peak of an arched doorway filled with rubble, broken timber, blocks of fallen stone. But there at the very top, a smudge of light. Auri stood in front of the mirror and took the bristle brush from where it hung on the mirror's wooden frame. She brushed the sleep snarl from her hair until it hung about her like a cloud. She closed her hand over Foxen, and without his blue-green shine, the room went dark as dark. Then her eyes stretched wide, and she could see nothing but the soft, faint smudge of warm light spilling past the rubble high behind her. Pale golden light caught in her pale golden hair. Auri grinned at herself in the mirror. She looked like the sun. Lifting her hand, she uncovered Foxen and skipped quickly off into the sprawling maze of rubric. It was barely a minute's work to find a copper pipe with the right kind of cloth wrapping, but finding the perfect place, well, that was the trick, wasn't it? She followed the pipe through the round red brick tunnels for nearly half a mile, careful not to let it slip away from her among the countless other twining pipes. Then, with no hint of warning, the pipe kinked hard and dove straight into the curving wall, abandoning her. Rude thing. There were countless other pipes, of course, but the tiny tin ones had no wrap at all. The icy ones of burnished steel were far too new. The iron pipes were so eager as to be almost embarrassing, but their wrappings were all cotton, and that was more trouble than she cared to bother with today. So Auri followed a fat ceramic pipe as it bumbled along. Eventually it burrowed deep into the ground, but where it bent, its linen wrap hung loose and ragged as an urchin's shirt. Auri smiled and unwound the strip of cloth with gentle fingers, taking great care not to tear it. Eventually it came away, a perfect thing, a single gauzy piece of greying linen, long as Auri's arm. It was tired but willing, and after folding it upon itself, she turned and pelted madly off through echoing umbral, then down and down into the 12. The 12 was one of the rare changing places of the Underthing. It was wise enough to know itself, and brave enough to be itself, and wild enough to change itself while somehow staying altogether true. It was nearly unique in this regard, and while it was not always safe or kind, Auri could not help but feel a fondness for it. Today, the high arch of space was just as she was. Sunlight speared down through the open gratings far above, striking down into the deep, narrow valley. The light filled past pipes, support beams, and the strong, straight line of ancient wooden walls. of the street drifted down to the far below bottom of things. Auri heard the sound of hooves on cobblestones, sharp and round as a cracking knuckle. She heard the distant thunder of a passing wagon and the dim mingle of voices. Threading through it all was the high, angry cry of a babe who clearly wanted tit and wasn't getting. At the bottom of the yellow 12, there was a long, deep pool with water smooth as glass. The sunlight from above was bright enough that Auri could see all the way down to the second snarl of pipes beneath the surface. She already had straw here, and 3 bottles waited on a narrow ledge of stone along one wall. But looking at them, Auri frowned. There was a green one, a brown one, and a clear one. There was a wide wire baling top, a grey twisting lid, and a cork fat as a fist. They were all different shapes and sizes, but none of them were quite right. Exasperated, Auri threw her hands into the air. So she ran back to Mantle, her bare feet slapping on the stone. Once there, she eyed the grey glass bottle with the lavender inside. She picked it up, looked it over carefully, then set it back down in its proper place before she scampered out again. Auri hurried through port, heading out by way of the slanting doorway this time rather than the crack in the wall. She twisted up through Withy, Foxen throwing wild shadows on the walls. As she ran, her hair streamed out behind her like a banner. She took the spiraling stairs through Dark House, down and around, down and around. When she finally heard moving water and the tink of glass, she knew she'd crossed the threshold into place. Soon Foxen's light reflected off the roiling pool of black water that swallowed the bottom of the spiraling stairs. There were 2 bottles perched in a shallow niche there, one blue and narrow, one green and squat. Auri tilted her head and closed one eye, then reached out to touch the green one with 2 fingers. She grinned, snatched it up, and ran back up the stairs. Heading back, she went through vaults for a change of air. Running down the hall, she sprang over the first deep fissure in the broken floor as lithely as a dancer. The second crack, she leapt as lightly as a bird. The third, she jumped as wildly as a pretty girl who looked like the sun. She came into the yellow 12 all puffed and panting. As she caught her breath, she tucked Foxen in the green bottle, padded him carefully with straw, and locked down the hasp against the rubber gasket, sealing the lid down tight. She held it up to her face, then grinned and kissed the bottle before setting it carefully by the edge of the pool. Auri shucked off her favorite dress and hung it on a bright brass pipe. She grinned and shivered a little, nervous fish swimming in her stomach. Then, standing in her altogether, she gathered up her floating hair with both her hands. She brushed it back and bound it, winding and tying it behind her with the strip of old grey linen cloth. When she was done, it made a long tail that hung down to the small of her back. Arms held close against her chest, Auri took 2 tiny steps to stand beside the pool. She dipped a toe into the water, then her whole foot. She grinned at the feel of it, chill and sweet as peppermint. Then she lowered herself down, both legs dangling in the water. Auri balanced for a moment, holding her naked self up with both hands, away from the cold stone lip at the edge of the pool. But there was no avoiding it. So Auri puckered up and settled herself the rest of the way down. There was nothing peppermint about the cold stone edge. It was a dull, blunt bite against her tender, altogether hindmost self. She turned herself around then and began to lower herself into the water. She went slowly, tickling around with her feet until she found the little jut of stone. She curled her toes around it, holding herself thigh-deep in the pool. Then she drew a few deep breaths, screwed her eyes shut, and bared her teeth before letting go with her toes and ducking her nethers underneath the surface. She squeaked a little. and the chill made her whole self go goose prickle. The worst over, she closed her eyes and dunked her head beneath the water too. Gasping and blinking, she rubbed the water out of her eyes. She had her big all-over shiver then, one arm folded across her breasts. But by the time it was done, her grimace had turned to grin. Without her halo of hair, Auri felt small. Not the smallness that she strove for every day, not the smallness of a tree among trees, of a shadow underground, and not just small of body either. She knew there was not much of her. When she thought to look more closely at her standing mirror, the girl she saw was tiny as an urchin begging on the street. The girl she saw was thin as thin, her cheekbones high and delicate, her collarbones pressed tight against her skin. But no, with her hair pulled back and wetted down besides, she felt less. She felt tamped down, dim, more faint. Feigned. It would have been pure unpleasant without the perfect strip of linen. If not for that, she wouldn't merely feel like a wick rolled down, she would be downright guttery. It was worth it, doing things the proper way. Finally, the last of her trembling stopped. The fish were still turning in her stomach, but her grin was eager. The golden daylight from above struck down into the pool, straight and bright and steady as a spear. Auri drew a deep breath, then pushed it out, wriggling her toes. She took another deep breath and let it out more slowly, then a third breath. Auri gripped the neck of Foxen's bottle in one hand, let go of the stone edge of the pool, and dove beneath the water. The angle of the light was perfect, and Auri saw the first pipe tangle clear as anything. Minnow quick, she turned and glided smoothly through, not letting any of them touch her. Below that was the second snarl. She pushed an old iron pipe with her foot to keep herself moving downward, then tugged a valve with her free hand as she went past, changing speed and sliding through the narrow space between two wrist-thick copper pipes. The spear light faded as she sank, leaving only Foxen's blue-green glow. But his light was muted here, filtered through straw and water and the thick green glass. Auri made her mouth a perfect O and puffed out 2 quick bursts of bubbles. The pressure grew as she went deeper, shapes looming dimly by her in the dark. An old walkway, a tilting slab of rock, an ancient algae-covered wooden beam. Her outstretched fingers found the bottom sooner than her eyes, and Auri swept her hand across the half-seen surface of the smooth stone floor. Back and forth, quick but wary. Sometimes there were sharp things here. Then her fingers closed on something long and smooth. A stick? She tucked it underneath her arm and let herself begin to float back up toward the distant light. Her free hand found familiar pipes, pulling and steering, twisting through the maze of half-seen shapes. Her lungs began to ache a bit, and she released a stream of bubbles as she rose. Her face broke the surface near the edge, and in the golden light she saw what she had found. A clean, white bone. Long, but not a leg. An arm. The prima axial. She ran her fingers down the length of it and felt a tiny seam that ran all round it like a ring, showing it had broken and long healed. It was full of pleasant shadows. Smiling, Auri set it aside. Then she drew 3 slow, deep breaths, gripped Foxen tight, and dove into the pool again. This time she got her foot wedged tight between 2 pipes around the second tangle. Bad luck. She scowled and tugged, and after half a moment managed to pull free. She blew half her lungful out and kicked hard, dropping like a stone down into the black below. Despite the bad start, this was an easy catch. Her fingers found a tangle of something or other before they even touched the bottom. She had no guess what it might be. Something metal, something slick, and something hard, all jumbled up together. She gathered it close to her chest and started up again. This time she couldn't tuck her find beneath her arm for fear she'd lose some piece of it. So Aori nestled Foxen's bottle in the crook of her arm and pulled herself along with her left hand. It felt good, balanced, and she broke the surface, not even needing to blow the rest of her bubbles. She spread the tangle out by the edge of the pool. An old belt with a silver buckle so tarnished it was black as coal. A leafy branch with a bewildered snail, and lastly but not least, looped on a piece of rotten string all tangled with the branch, was a slender key as long as her first finger. Aori kissed the snail and apologized before setting the branch back in the water where it belonged. The leather of the belt was turned against itself, but at the slightest tug, the buckle came away. Both of them were better off than clinging to the stone edge of the pool, Aori shivered now in tiny waves. They moved across her shoulders and her chest. Her lips had gone from pink to pale pink tinged with blue. They picked up Fox's box and checked the bail to make sure. She looked down into the water, the fish in her stomach swimming and fighting. The third time was the lucky one. Aori pulled a breath and dove again, her body twisting smooth, her right hand finding all the friendly grip, down to the stone, the timber, then nothing but dim Foxen's light, colouring her outstretched hand a pale blue-green. It looked the way a water nixie's must. Her knuckles brushed the bottom, and she spun a bit to orient herself. She kicked and swept her hand about, skimming smoothly out along the black stone bottom of the pool. Then she saw a glint of light, and her fingers bumped something solid and cold, all hard lines and smooth. It was full of love and answers, so full she felt them spilling out at just her briefest touch. For the space of 10 hard heartbeats, Aori thought it must be fastened to the stone. Then it slid, and she realized the truth. It was a weighty thing. After a long, slippery moment, her tiny fingers found a way to pry it up. It was solid metal, thick as a book. It was oddly shaped and heavy as a bar of raw iridium. Aori brought it to her chest and felt its edges dig into her skin. Then she bent her knees and pushed off hard against the bottom with both feet, looking up toward the distant shimmer of the surface. She kicked and kicked, but barely seemed to move. The metal thing dragged, pulling her down. Her foot bumped hard against a thick iron pipe, and Aori took the chance to brace herself and give another push. She felt a rush of motion up that slowed as soon as her foot left the iron behind. Her lungs were fighting with her now. Half full, the dumb things wanted air. She puffed out a mouthful of bubbles, trying to trick them, knowing every bubble lost would weigh her down, knowing she wasn't even near the bottom tangle yet. Aori tried to shift the metal thing to the crook of her arm so she could pull herself along. But when she tried, the smoothness of it slipped a little in her fingers. In the sudden panic afterwards, she clutched, fumbled, and Foxen's bottle knocked against some unseen shape. He slid and jostled free of Aori's grip. Aori snatched with her free hand, but her knuckles only battered Foxen farther off away. And for a moment, Aori froze. To let the metal drop would be unthinkable. But Foxen? He had been with her forever. She watched as Foxen's bottle was caught by an eddy and swirled well out of reach behind a trio of slanting copper pipes. Her lungs were angry now. She clenched her teeth and grabbed a nearby lip of stone with her now free hand, pulling herself up. Her lungs were heaving hard inside her now, so she slowly loosed her bubbles, though she hadn't even glimpsed the lowest tangle yet. It was dark without Foxen, but at least she was moving, pulling herself up in sudden, awkward jerks, using whatever strange handholds she could find. She kicked, but there was little to be gained from that, burdened as she was with the heavy lump of sharp, hard love she held so tightly to her chest. Was it the answers that it held that gave it so much weight? Finally, she dragged herself into the lower nest of pipes, but her lungs were empty now, and her body hung like lead. Normally, she twisted through the tangle like a fish, her body never brushing the pipes. But she was heavy and empty. One-handed, she groped and bucked her way through them. She banged her knee and frantically slid her back along something sharp with rust. She stretched out an arm, but heavy as she was, her fingers didn't even brush her usual handhold. She kicked, gained another inch or two, then, despite her careful binding, her hair snagged on something. It jerked her to a sudden stop, snapping her head back and spinning her body sideways in the water. Almost immediately she felt herself begin to sink. She flailed out wildly. Her shin struck a pipe, making her whole self tingle with pain. But she quickly sorted out with her other foot, braced and shoved off hard. She shot up like a cork, fast enough so that her hair tore free from whatever rude thing had caught it. The sharp tug snapped her head back hard, forcing her mouth open. She began to drown then. Mouth full of water, she choked and gagged. But even as the water filled her nose and throat, Auri feared nothing so much as the thought her hand might slip, that she would lose her grip and let the heavy jag of metal slide away into the dark. Losing Foxen was bad. It would leave her blind and lonely in the dark. Being trapped beneath the pipes and choking out her life was awful too, but neither of those things were wrong. Letting the metal slide into the dark simply could not be done. It was unthinkable. It was so unkilter that it terrified her. Her hair was unbound now, and it swirled around her in the water like a cloud of smoke. Her hand grabbed a curve of pipe, comforting, familiar. She pulled herself up, then grabbed again and found another grip. She clenched her teeth, choked, pulled and grabbed. She broke the surface, gasping and spluttering, then slid under the water again. A second later, she claw-clambered her way up again. This time, her free hand caught the stone edge of the pool. Auri heaved the thing out of the water, and it struck the stone floor with the sound of a bell. It was a bright brass gear, big as a platter, thicker than her thumb with some to spare. It had a hole in the middle, 9 teeth, and a jagged gap where a 10th had long ago been torn away. It was full of true answers and love and hearthlight. It was beautiful. Auri smiled and heaved up half a stomachful of water on the stone, then heaved again, turning her head so that it didn't splash against the bright brass gear. She coughed then, took a mouthful of water and spat it back into the pool. The brass gear lay heavy as a heart on the cold stones of the yellow 12. The light from above made the surface of it shimmerant and gold. It looked like a piece of sun she'd brought up from the deep. Auri coughed again and shivered. Then she reached out and touched it with one finger. She smiled to look at it. Her lips were blue. She trembled. Her heart was full of joy. After she pulled herself out of the water, Auri looked around the pool at the bottom of the 12. Though she knew better, she hoped to see Foxen bobbing idly on the surface. Nothing. Her face was solemn then. She thought of going back. But no. 3 times. That was the way of things. But the thought of leaving Foxen in the dark was enough to put a fine, thin crack straight through her heart. To lose him after all this time. Then Auri caught a glimpse of something deep below the surface. A glint. A glow. She grinned. Foxon looked for all the world like a great bumbrous firefly as he bobbled and bumped his slow way slowly up through all the tangled pipes. She waited 5 long minutes, watching Foxon's bottle bob and drift until it finally popped up to the surface like a duck. Then she caught it up and kissed it. She held it to her chest. Oh, yes, it was well worth it, doing things the proper way. First things first, Auri freed Foxon from the bottle and set it next to the others on the wall. Then she headed down to Clink's and rinsed herself in the roiling water there. Then she washed herself using a slender remnant of the cake of soap that smelled of sinister root and summer. After soaping and scrubbing and cleaning her hair, Auri dove into the endless black water of Clink to rinse herself one final time. Under the surface, something brushed against her. Something slick and heavy pressed its moving weight against her. It did not bother her. Whatever it was in its proper place, and so was she. Things were just as they should. Dripping clean and wringing out her hair, Auri headed off through town. Not the quickest way, but it would be unseemly to head through Dunning's in nothing but her pinkness. But even taking the longer way, it wasn't long before she turned the corner into Baker's, wet feet slapping on the stone. She rested Foxon on a piece of jutting brick nearby, as he wasn't fond of too much heat. The thick steel pipes along the tunnel's wall were too hot to stand near today, and the walls and floor had been basking until they too were all crickly with heat. Auri spun in a slow circle to keep any part of her tender altogether from getting roasted by the silent red roar pouring off the pipes. It was only moments before the place had dried her skin, set her fine hair floating, and cooked the shivers from her icy bones. After that, she fetched her favorite dress from the Yellow 12. She slid it over her head, then carried all her treasures back to port, where she arranged them on the central table. The leather belt was etched in odd curling patterns. The great brass gear was bright straight through. The key was black as black. The buckle, though, it was black with bright beneath. It was a hidden thing. Might the buckle be for him? That would be a good beginning to the day. A nice thing to have settled early on. His gift all ready with his visit days away. Auri eyed the buckle sharply. Was it a proper gift for him? He was a tangled sort, and he was much hidden too. Nodding, she reached out to touch the cool dark metal. But no, it didn't suit him. She should have known. He was not a one for fastening, for holding close. Neither was he dark. Oh no, he was emberent, incarnadine. He was bright with better bright beneath, like copper gilded gold. The gear would need consideration. It almost felt like it could be for him, but that could wait. The key needed urgent tending. It was, for certain, the most restless of the lot. This wasn't even a slim sliver of surprise. Keys were hardly known for their complacency, and this one was near howling for a lock. Auri picked it up and turned it in her hands. A door. She wasn't shy about the fact at all. Black key. White day. She touched her head. The shape of things was right. It was a finding day, and there was no doubt the poor thing badly wanted to. She nodded to herself and slipped the key into the pocket of her dress. Even so, before she left, Auri helped everything to find its proper place. The belt stayed on the central table, obviously. The bottle moved to rest beside the dish of resin. The bone nestled almost indecently close to the hollyberry. The gear was troublesome in this regard. She set it on the bookshelf, then moved it to the table in the corner. It leaned against the wall, the gap from its lost tooth pointing up into the air. Auri frowned. It wasn't quite the proper place. Auri brought out the key and held it in front of the gear, black and brass, both for turning. They had 12 teeth between them. She shook her head and sighed. She put the key back into her pocket and left the great brass gear on the bookshelf. It wasn't the proper place for it, but it was the best that she could do for now. Burrow was closest, so Auri hurried there, ducking her head through the low stone doorways until she came to the first of its doors. Standing there, Auri cupped Foxen in her palm and huffed a gentle breath onto him, fanning his light. The wooden door was huge and grey with age, its hinges hardly more than flaking rust. She drew the key out of her pocket and held it out in front of her, between herself and the great grey door. She looked back and forth between them, then turned and padded away. 3 left turns and through a broken window to the second door, also old and grey, but larger than the first. Here she barely needed to glance at them before she knew the truth. This wasn't right. These weren't the proper doors. Where then? Tenors? Black door? She shivered. Not black door. Not on a white day. Wayne's instead, then tenors, even through bottom. This was not a key for black door, no. Auri hurried through rubric, turning left twice and right twice for balance, making sure to never follow any of the pipes too far lest she offend. Next came Greeley with its twisting ways and its sulphurant smell. She got a little lost there among the crumbling walls, but eventually made her right way to Crumbledon, a narrow dirt tunnel so steep it was little more than a hole. Auri scampered down on a long ladder made of lashed-together sticks. The bottom of the ladder dropped into a tiny, tidy room of finished stone. It was no bigger than a closet, empty except for an old oak door all bound in brass. Auri brushed off her hand, swung the door open, and stepped lightly into Wayne's. The hallway was wide enough to drive a wagon through, high-ceilinged and long enough that Foxen's light could barely reach the tangle of debris that blocked the far end. Above her, blue-white light scattered off a crystal chandelier. Dark wood paneling hugged the lower portion of the walls, but above that was ornate plasterwork. There were broad frescoes decorating the ceiling. Women in gauze lounged about, whispering and rubbing oil on each other. Men frolicked about in the water, flapping around ridiculously in their absolute altogether. Auri took a moment to look at the pictures as she always did, grinning wickedly. She shifted her weight from side to side, the polished marble floor chill beneath her tiny feet. Both ends of Wayne's were blocked by fallen rock and earth, but in the middle it was clean as a crucible. Everything dry and tight as you please. No damp, no mold, no drafts to bring in dust. Altogether, men or no, it was a seemly place, so Auri was careful to comport herself with full decorum. There were 12 oak doors lining the hall, all fine and tight and bound in brass. Over her long years in the underthing, Auri had opened 3 of them. She walked down the hall, Foxen glowing brightly in her upheld hand. After a dozen steps, a glimmer on the marble floor caught her eye. Skipping close, she saw a crystal had fallen from the chandelier to lay unbroken on the floor. It was a lucky thing, and brave. She picked it up and put it in the pocket that didn't have the key inside. They would only fuss if they were put together. It wasn't the 3rd door, or the 7th. Auri was already planning her route down to Through Bottom when she spied the 9th door. It was waiting, eager. The latch turned and the door eased smoothly open on silent hinges. Auri stepped inside, pulled the key from her pocket and kissed it before she lay it carefully on an empty table just inside the door. The tiny tap as it touched the wood warmed her heart. She smiled to see it sitting there all snug and in its proper place. It was a sitting room, very fine. Auri sat Foxen in a wall sconce and went to have a careful look around. A tall velvet chair, a low wooden table, a plush couch on a plush carpet. In the corner was a tiny cart filled with glasses and bottles. They were very dignified. There was something wrong with the room. Nothing looming. Nothing like him sit twice or face thing. No, this was a good place. A nearly perfect place. Everything was almost. If this hadn't been a white day with everything done properly, she might not have been able to tell something was amiss. Still, it was, and she did. Auri stepped around the room, hands clasped primly behind her back. She eyed the carts, more than a dozen bottles, all colours, some stoppered and full, some holding little more than dust. There was a burnished silver gear watch on one of the tables near the couch. There was a ring, too, and a scattering of coins. Auri eyed them curiously, touching nothing. She moved daintily. One step, another. The dark plush of the carpet was sweet beneath her feet, like moss, and when she bent down to run her fingers over the hush of it, she glimpsed a tiny whiteness underneath the couch. She reached deep into the shadows with a small white hand, having to stretch a bit before her fingers caught it. Smooth and cool. It was a tiny figurine carved from a piece of pale, retiring stone. A small soldier with clever lines to show his hauberk and his shield. But his truest treasure was the sweetness of his face, kind enough for kissing. It didn't belong here, but it wasn't wrong. Or rather, it wasn't what was wrong with the room. The poor thing was simply lost. Auri smiled and put the doll in her pocket with the crystal. It was then she felt a tiny bump beneath one foot. She pulled up the edge of the carpet, rolled it back, and found a small bone button underneath. Auri eyed it for a long moment before giving it an understanding smile. That wasn't it either. The button was just as it should be. Moving carefully, she lay the carpet back exactly as she'd found it, patting it into place with her hands. She looked around the room again. It was a good place, and almost entirely as it ought to be. There wasn't really anything for her to do here. It was startling, really, as the place had obviously been alone for ages without anyone tending it. Even so, there was something wrong. Some lack. Some tiny thing, like a single cricket legging madly in the night. A second door sat on the other side of the room, eager to be opened. She worked the latch, walked through a hallway, only to come to the foot of a set of stairs. There she looked around with some surprise. She'd thought that she was still in Wayne's, but clearly not. This was a different place entirely. Auri's heart beat faster then. It had been ages since she'd come on somewhere wholly new, a place that dared to be entirely itself. Still, carefully, in fox and steady light, Auri looked closely at the walls and ceiling. A few cracks, but nothing thicker than a thumb. A few small stones had fallen, and there was dirt and mortar on the steps as well. The walls were bare and slightly condescending. No, she had obviously left Wayne's behind. She ran a hand over the stones and the steps. The first few were solid, but the fourth was loose, as were the sixth and seventh, and the 10th. There was a landing halfway up, but a stairway turned back on itself. There was a door, but it was terribly bashful, so Auri politely pretended not to see it. She made her careful way up the second flight of steps, and found half of them were also loose or prone to kicking. Then she went back down the stairs, making sure she found all the shifting stones. She out. It was terribly exciting. The place was tricky as a drunken tinker, and a little sly. It had a temper, too. It would be hard to find a place less like a garden path. Some places had names. Some places changed, or they were shy about their names. Some places had no names at all, and that was always sad. It was one thing to be private, but to have no name at all? How horrible. How lonely. Auri made her way up the stairs a second time, testing each one with her feet, avoiding the spots she knew were bad. As she climbed, she couldn't tell what sort of place this was. Shy or secret? Lost or lonely? A puzzling place. It made her grin all the wider. At the top of the stairs, the ceiling had collapsed, but there was a gap made by a broken wall. Aori stepped through and found herself grinning with the thrill of it. Another new place. 2 in one day. Her bare feet shifted back and forth on the gritty stone floor, almost dancing with excitement. This place was not so coy as the stairway. Its name was Tumbrel. It was scattered and half fallen and half full. There was so much to see. Half the ceiling had fallen in and everything was covered in dust. But for all its fallen stone, it was dry and tight. No damp, just dust and stiff air. More than half the room was a solid mass of fallen earth and stone and timber. The remnants of a 4-post bed lay crushed beneath the wreckage. In the unfallen portion of the room, there was a triune mirror vanity and a dark wooden wardrobe taller than a tall woman standing on her toes. Aori peered shyly through the wardrobe's half-open doors. She glimpsed a dozen dresses there, all velvet and embroidery, shoes, a robe of silk, some gauzy bits of the sort the women wore in the frescoes down in Wayne's. The vanity was a rakish thing, garrulous and unashamed. The top was scattered with pots of powders, small brushes, sticks of eye paint, bracelets and rings, combs of horn and ivory and wood. There were pins and pens and a dozen bottles, some substantial, some delicate as petals. It was in startling disarray. Everything resting atop the vanity was somehow askew. Powders were spilled, bottles toppled, the dish of pins all higgledy-piggledy. Dishevel or no, Aori couldn't help but take a liking to the thing, gruff and bawdy as it was. She sat primly on the edge of the straight-backed chair. She ran her fingers through her floating hair and smiled to see herself reflected in a triptych. There was a door, too, opposite the broken wall. It was half buried by a broken beam and blocks of shattered stone, but hidden as it wasn't shy. Aori went to work then, setting things to rights as best she could. She shifted the wooden beam that blocked the door, lifting and straining a few inches at a time until she could lever at it with another piece of fallen timber. Then she cleared away the stones, pushing the ones she could not carry, rolling the ones she could not push. She found the wreckage of a small table underneath the stones, and amid the splintered wood she found a length of fine white tatted lace. She folded this up carefully and put it in her pocket with the crystal and the small stone soldier. Once the way was clear, the door pulled open easily, its rusted hinges moaning. Inside was a small closet. There was an empty porcelain chamber pot. There was a wooden bucket, a brush of the sort you would use to scrub the deck of a ship, and a tight birch broom. On the back of the door hung 2 empty linen sacks. The smaller of these was anxious to be about its business, so Aori smiled and tucked it in a pocket by itself. The broom was eager after being trapped so long, so Aori brought it out and set to sweeping, brushing ancient dust and earth into a tidy pile. After that, it was still restless, so Aori went to sweep the unnamed stairs. She brought Fox and Wiz. She would hardly trust a place like that to leave in the dark. But since a proper birching of the place required 2 hands, Aori tied Fox into a long lock of her hanging hair. Foxen's dignity was somewhat bruised by this, and Aori kissed him in sincere apology for this. But they both knew he took a certain secret from swingling wildly all, making the shadows spin and skirt. So for a while he hung and swung. Aori took care not to notice any undue exuberance on his part while she gave the unnamed stairs a once-over. Up and down, then up again, the tight birch broom flicked and tickled the stone steps clear of fallen rocks and grit and dust. They were flattered by their attention while remaining entirely coy. After returning the broom to the closet, Aori brought out the chamber and set it near the wardrobe. She spun it slightly so it faced the proper way. seemed all askew, but nothing called out for tidying. The only exception was the hairbrush, which she moved closer to the ruby ring. Auri crossed her arms and stared at the vanity flower. Then she went down on hands and knees and looked at its other side. She opened the drawers and moved the handkerchiefs from the left-hand drawer to the right, then frowned and moved them back again. Finally, she pushed the entire thing about 2 handspans to the left, slightly closer to the wall, careful not to let anything tumble to the floor. She slid the vanity's high-backed chair the same amount, so it still faced the mirror. Then she picked up the chair and examined the bottoms of its feet before putting it back in place with a dip. There was a loose stone in the floor next to the wardrobe. Auri prized it up with her fingers, adjusted the small leather sack and piece of wool padding underneath, slid the stone back into place, tamping it down firmly with the handle of the broom. She tested it with one foot and smiled when it no longer shifted under her weight. Lastly, she opened the wardrobe. She moved the dress of burgundy velvet away from the gown of pale blue. She replaced the lid of a tall hat box that had come ajar. She opened the drawer at the bottom of the wardrobe. Her breath caught her chest. Folded tidily away at the bottom of the drawer was 6 perfect sheets, pale and smooth. Auri reached down to touch one and was amazed at the tightness of it. So fine her fingers could feel the thread. It was cool and sweet to the touch, like a lover come to kiss her, fresh in from the pool. Auri brushed her hand across the surface. How lovely might it be to sleep on such a sheet, to lay on it, feel the sweetness of it all along her naked skin. She shivered, and her fingers curled around the folded edges of the sheet. Hardly realizing the shiver, she drew it from its proper place and brought it to her chest. She brushed her lips against its smoothness. There were other sheets beneath it, surely enough for a place like Tumble. Besides, she'd set so many other things to rights, surely... She looked down at the sheets for a long moment. While her eyes were all softness and light, her mouth grew firm and fury. That was not the way of things. She knew better. She knew perfectly well where the sheet belonged. Auri closed her eyes and put the sheet back in the drawer, shame burning in her chest. She was a greedy thing sometimes, wanting for herself, twisting the world all out of proper shape, pushing everything about with the weight of her desire. She closed the drawer and came to her feet. Looking around, she nodded to herself. She'd made a good idea. The vanity was obviously in need of some attention, but she couldn't taste the nature of it yet. Still, the place had a name, and everything obvious was tended to. Auri took Foxen and headed down the unnamed stair, through Rezz and Crumbledon and all the way back. She fetched fresh water and washed her face and hands and feet. After that, she felt much better. On a whim, she sprinted off to the Darkmoon. She hadn't visited in ages and missed the warm earth smell of it, the closeness of the woods. Running lightly on her toes, Auri danced through rubric, ducking pipes. She skipped through woods, reaching out to swing herself from time-worn beams that held the sagging roof at bay. Finally, she came to a swollen wooden door. Stepping through, she held Foxen high. She smelled the air. She grinned. She knew exactly where she was. Everything was just where it should be.
For Vi, without whom there might be no story, and Tunnelbot, without whom there would be no Auri. Forward. You might not want to buy this audiobook. I know that's not the sort of thing an author is supposed to say. The marketing people aren't going to like this, and my editor is going to have a fit. But I'd rather be honest with you right out. First, if you haven't listened to my other books, you really don't want to start here. My first two books are The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear. If you're curious to try my writing, start there. They're the best introduction to my world. This book deals with Ari, one of the characters from these series. And without the context of those books, you're probably going to feel powerless. Second, even if you have read or listened to my other books, I think it's only fair to warn you that this is a bit of a strange story. I don't go in for spoilers, but suffice to say that this one is different. It doesn't do a lot of the things a classic story is supposed to do. And if you're looking for a continuation of Kvothe's storyline, you're not going to find it here. On the other hand, if you'd like to learn more about Ari, this story has a lot to offer. If you love words and mysteries and secrets, if you're curious about the Underthing and alchemy, if you want to know more about the hidden turnings of my world, well, then this audiobook might be for you.
The far below bottom of things. When Auri woke, she knew that she had 7 days. Yes, she was quite sure of it. He would come for a visit on the 7th day. A long time, long for waiting, but not so long for everything that needed to be done. Not if she were careful. Not if she wanted to be ready. Opening her eyes, Auri saw a whisper of dim light, a rare thing as she was tucked tidily away in mantle.
Very strange. All this I already heard.
It was a white
The chapters are not sorted right.
Finding day. She
Just
smiled,
checked it,
excitement
but
fizzing in her chest.
it plays in order. Amazon messed it up.
Found the drop bottle on her bedsheet. She unscrewed it and let a single drip fall into Foxen's dish. After a moment, he slowly brightened into a faint, gloaming blue. Moving carefully, Auri pushed back her blanket so it wouldn't touch the floor. She slipped out of bed, the stone floor warm beneath her feet. Her basin rested on the table near her bed, next to a sliver of her sweetest soap, pale blue silk. She replaced the lid of a tall hat box, sweet to the touch, like a lover come to kiss her, fresh in from the cold. Auri brushed her hand across the surface. How lovely might it be to sleep on such a sheet, to lay on it and feel the...
Yeah.
What a look entailed. The second day, Auri woke to silence in the perfect dark. That meant a turning day, a doing day. Good. There was much to do before he came. She wasn't nearly ready. She roused Foxen and folded up her blanket, careful to keep the corners off the floor. She glanced around the room. Her box and leaf and lavender were fine. Her bed was fine. Everything was just as it should be. There were 3 ways out of Mantle. The hallway was for later. The doorway was for now. The door was oak, bound in iron. Auri did not look at it. In port, the stone figurine and the length of lace had made themselves at home. The brave crystal was content in the wine rack. The arm bone and linen sack were so comfortable you'd think they'd been there for 100 years. The old black buckle was crowding the resin a bit, but that was quickly mended. She nudged it to one side to keep things civilized. She looked around and sighed. Everything was fine except for the great brass gear. It exasperated her. She picked the crystal up and set it next to the gear. But that didn't help at all, and just upset her. It was brave enough for 10, but it wasn't for the corner table. She gave it a quick kiss by way of apology and returned it to the wine rack. Auri picked up the heavy gear with both hands and brought it into Mantle. It was unheard of, really, but by this point, it was something at last. She set it on a narrow ledge of stone on the wall opposite her bed. She tipped it so the empty gap its missing tooth made was straight up toward the ceiling, as if it were reaching upward with its too short the arms. Stepping back, she looked at it and sighed. But even so, it wasn't quite the proper place. Auri washed her face and hands and feet. Her thin sliver of soap smelled of sunlight, and that made her smile. Then she slipped into her second favorite dress, as it had better pockets. It was a turning day after all. In port, she put her linen gather sack over one shoulder, tucking a few things in. Then she packed her pockets full. Before she left, Auri glanced back into Mantel's brazen gear. But no, if it had wanted to come, it should have been content to stay in port. Proud thing. In Van, she was startled to find the mirror was unsettled, anxious even. Hardly an auspicious start to her day. Still, it was the sort of thing only a fool would willfully ignore. And Auri was no fool. Besides, the mirror had been around for quite a while, so she knew its little ways. It wanted moving, but it needed to be settled. It needed to be coaxed. It needed covering. So despite the fact that she was yet unbrushed, Auri gathered up Thompson and took the long way down to Wales, walking slowly to her newly opened door as she eyed the frescoes overhead. She stopped briefly in the sitting room, looking around. The tiny wrongness was still there, like a hint of gristle in her teeth. It wouldn't bother her if everything else here wasn't almost circle perfect. But some things simply can't be done. Auri knew this for a fact. Besides, she needed the mirror set to rights before anything else. That meant covering. So she headed up the unnamed stair, her feet skipping back and forth to miss the unsafe stones. Then she headed through the broken wall and into Tumbrel. Once there, Auri opened up the wardrobe's drawer. She did not touch the sheets. Instead, her hands went to her pockets. She felt the smooth facets of the brave crystal. No, she touched the curved lines of the kind stone figurine. No. The flat black rock? No. Then her fingers touched the buckle, and she smiled. She brought it out and set it gently in the drawer. Then she lifted out the topmost folded sheet. It was smooth and creamy in her hands, pale as ivory. Auri stopped then, looking at the blackness of the buckle in the drawer. There was a stone in her stomach. It didn't belong here. Oh, it seemed sensible. Oh, yes, certainly. But she knew what seeming was worth in the end, didn't she? Reluctantly, she lay the sheet back in the drawer. Her fingers ran over its perfect whiteness, smooth and clean and new. There was a hint of winter in it. But no, there is a difference between the truth and what we wish were true. Sighing, Auri took the buckle back and pushed it deep into her pocket. Leaving the sheet where it was, Auri headed back to Mantle. She moved more slowly now. The trip down the unnamed stair cheered her somewhat. Her path staggered drunkenly back and forth as she moved from one safe section to another. A stone turned underneath her feet, and Auri pinwheeled her arms to keep from slipping. She cocked her head to the side, standing balanced on one foot. Was this place tippled then? No, she was too sly for that. The mirror was still restless back in Van, and with no better options, Auri was forced to fetch her blanket from her bed. Careful not to let it touch the ground, she draped it over the mirror before turning it to face the wall. Only then could it be moved across the room so that it stood before the bricked-over window where it so desperately wanted to be. She returned her blanket to Mantle and washed her face and hands and feet. Coming back to Van, she saw her time had been well spent. She'd never seen her mirror so content. Grinning at herself, she brushed the elf knots from her hair until it hung around her like a golden cloud. But just as she was finishing, when she lifted up her arms to push her cloud of hair behind her, Auri staggered just a bit, all sudden dizzy. After it passed, she walked slowly to Cricklet and took a long, deep drink. She felt the cool water run all along her insides with nothing to stop. She felt hollow inside. Her stomach was an empty fist. Her feet wanted to go to Apple Court, but she knew there were no apples left. He wouldn't be waiting there anyway, not until the 7th day, which was good, really. She had nothing suitable to share, nor nothing halfway good enough to be a proper gift. So she went to Tree instead. Her pans were hanging in their proper places, her spirit lamp just so. The cracked clay cup was sitting quietly. Everything was just as it should be. That said, she had more tools than food in Tree. On the shelves there was the sack of salt he'd given her. There were 4 fat figs swaddled modestly in a sheet of folded paper, a single, lonely, withered apple. A handful of dried cheese sat sadly at the bottom of a clear glass jar. Set into the stone counter was a chill well, running with a slow but constant stream of icy water. But it was keeping nothing cool save for a lump of yellow butter, and that was full of nothing, scarcely fit for eating. On the counter was a fine and wondrous thing, a silver bowl all brimming full of nutmeg pieces. Round and brown and smooth as river stones, they had come visiting from long-off lands. They filled the air, almost singing if they're far away. Auri eyed them longingly and ran her fingertips along the edge of their silver bowl. It was etched with twining leaves. But no. Rare and lovely as they were, she did not think they would be good for eating. Not now, at any rate. In that way, they were like the butter. Not food, exactly. They were mysteries that wished to bide their time in Tree. Auri climbed onto the stone counter so she could reach the apple where it perched up high upon its shelf. Then she sat next to the chill well, cross-legged, back straight, and cut the apple into 7 equal pieces before eating it. It was leathery and full of autumn. After that, she was still hungry, so she brought down the paper and lay it in front of herself, unfolding it carefully. Then she ate 3 of the figs, taking dainty bites and humming to herself. By the time she finished, her hands weren't shaking anymore. She wrapped the single fig back up and set it on the shelf, then climbed down to the fig. She cupped some water from the well and drank it. She grinned. It gave her belly shivers. After eating, Auri knew it was past time she found the brazen gear its proper place. She tried to flatter it at first. Using both hands, she sat it carefully atop the mantelpiece beside her box of stone. It ignored the compliment and simply sat there, not one bit more forthcoming than it had been before. Sighing, Auri picked it up with both hands and carried it to Umbra. But it wasn't happy in amongst the ancient barrels there. Neither did it want to rest in Cricklet near the stream. She carried it through all of Dark House, setting it on every windowsill, but none of them suited it in the least. Arms growing sore from the weight of it, Auri tried to feel irritated, but she couldn't stay angry. The gear was unlike anything she had ever seen before in all her years below. Just looking at it made her happy. And heavy as it was a joy to touch. It was a sweet thing, a silent bell that struck out love. All the while she carried it, it sang through her fingers of the secret answers that it held. No, she couldn't be angry. It was doing everything it could. It was her own fault for not knowing where it belonged. Answers were always important, but they were seldom easy. She would simply have to take her time and do things in the proper way. Just to be sure, Auri carried the gear back to where she'd found it. She would be sad to see it go, but sometimes there was nothing else to do. Some things simply were too true to stay. Some merely came to visit for a while. As Auri stepped inside the arcing darkness of the Grey 12, Foxen's light stretched up toward the unseen ceiling. His calm green glow reached out between the pipes that tangled on the walls. This was a different place today. That was its nature. Even so, Auri knew that she was welcome here, or if not welcome, at least indifferently ignored. Auri made her way farther into the room, where the deep black water of the pool lay smooth as glass. Carefully, she set the bright gear upright on the stone edge of pool. The gap from its broken tooth faced upward at an angle. She took a step back and covered Foxen with one hand. With nothing but the dim grey light from the grate above, the gear was nowhere near as shimmerant as it had been before. She eyed it closely for a breathless moment, head tilted to one side. Then she grinned. It didn't want to leave. That at least was clear. She picked it up and tried it on the narrow ledge above the pool beside her bottles. But it simply sat there, all aloof, coruscant with answers, taunting her. Auri sat cross-legged on the floor and tried to think what other place might fit the brazen gear. Mandrill? Candlebear? She heard a hush of feather in the air. Wings beat hard, then stopped. Looking up, Auri saw the shape of a nightjar outlined against the dull grey circle of light entering the grate high above. The bird struck something hard against the pipe, then ate it. A snail, she guessed. There was no need to guess the type of pipe, though. The ting of it let Auri know it was iron, black, and twice the thicken of her thumb. The nightjar tapped the pipe again, then dipped down to the pool to drink. After it drank, the bird winged quickly back to its previous perch. Back to stand in the center of the dim grey light. It tapped a third and final time. Auri's gut went cold. She sat up straight and eyed the bird intently. It stared back at her for a long moment, then flew away, having done what it had come to do. She looked after it numbly, the chill in her gut making a slow knot. She couldn't ask for things to be more clear than that. Her pulse began to hammer at her then, her palms all sudden sweat. She took off running and was gone a dozen steps before she remembered herself and hurried back. Embarrassed at her rudeness, she gave the brazen gear a kiss, so it would know she wasn't leaving it. She would be back. Then she turned and sprinted off. First to Mantle, where she washed her face and hands and feet. She took a handkerchief out of her cedar box and pelted down through rubric and downings to Burrow. Breathing hard, she finally stood before the unassuming wooden door that led to Tenants. Her gut all sour and chill with fear, Auri looked around the edges of the door and relaxed to see faint cobweb there. There was still time, perhaps. She pressed her ear against the wood and listened a long moment. Nothing. She slowly pulled it open. Standing anxious in the doorway, Auri peered into the dusty room. She eyed the cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. She eyed the tables strewn with dusty tools. She eyed the shelves packed with bottles, boxes, tin containers. She eyed the other door across the room. There was no hint of light around its edges. Auri did not like it here. It was not the under thing. This was a between place. It was not for her. But as much as she did not like it, the other options were all worse. She eyed the floor, covered with a fine layer of dust, except for a set of heavy boot prints, black smudges scuffing through the grey dust on the floor. The boot prints told a story. They entered from the other door, moved from a table to a nearby shelf, then made a line to the doorway where she stood. Auri glared at the spot where they crossed the threshold. As they left the dusty floor of tenants, the boot prints became invisible. They were for long gone. But even now, the sight made her heart sunk. Her skin was all hot prickle, indignant at the thought of them. A second set of boot prints told the story in reverse. They returned to tenants from the underthing. They moved to tables, shelf, and out the other door. They made a circle of sorts. A circuit. They were not new boot prints. Still, they told a story Auri did not like. They told a story she did not want to see repeated. She drew a breath to calm herself. There was no time for this. They would be coming, all hard boots and arrogance, and not one bit of proper knowledge of it. A cold sweat swept the trickle heat all off her skin. She drew another calming breath and focused. Her expression fierce, Auri took a deep breath and crossed the threshold into tenants. She placed her small white foot inside the black print of a boot. Her foot was small enough that this was no hard thing. Even so, she moved with slow deliberation. Her second step brought little more than her toes in contact with the floor. Her feet fit easily inside the boot prints, making no marks of their own. Thus she moved, one delicate step at a time. First to a shelf. She eyed containers before picking up a heavy bottle with a ground glass stopper. Next, she took a brush and felt the bristles with her finger. Then she made her way back to the door, her steps as slow and graceful as a fall. She closed the door behind her, then breathing out a sigh of deep relief, she ran herself to Rubric. Even moving quickly, it took an hour to find the property. Rubric's round brick tunnels ran the length and breadth of Underthing. Miles and miles of passages twisting up and down and doubling back, taking the pipes where they needed to go. Just as she was fearing she might never find it, just when she'd begun to fear it might not be in Rubric after all, Auri heard a sound like angry snakes and rain. If not for that, it might have taken her all day to track it down. She followed the noise until she could smell damp upon the air. Finally, turning a corner, she saw water bursting like a fountain from a cracked iron pipe. The spray had wet the bricks for 20 feet in each direction, and the other pipes were dripping with it too. The tiny brass pipes for pressed air didn't mind in the least, and the fat black piss pipe thought the whole thing rather funny. But the steam pipe was not best. Its thick lapping was soaked straight through, and it was grumbling and steaming, filling the tunnel with a musty hothouse damp. From where she stood, Auri eyed the dark line of the broken black iron pipe, carefully tracing it through the others. Foxen held high, she walked away from the lead, following the dark pipe backward. After 10 minutes and a quick detour through tenors, Auri found the valve, a small wheel barely big enough for both her hands. Setting down her brush and bottle, she gripped it tight and twisted. Nothing. So she brought the handkerchief out of her pocket, wrapped it round the wheel and tried it. Her teeth were bare with the effort. After a long moment, the ungreased edge of it gave way, and it grudgingly let itself be spun. She gathered up her tools and headed back. There was no sound of snakes. The spray had stopped, but the entire tunnel was still smooth. The air hung wet and heavy, making her hair stick and cling to her face. Auri sighed. It was just as Master Mandrag said so many years ago. She walked back where the tunnel floor was dry and sat cross-legged on the bricks among the tools. Then came the hardest part, the waiting grit. She had so much to do. This was important, certainly, but he was coming on the 7th day, and she was nowhere near to ready. She heard something in the distance, some echo of a sound, a scuff, a step, the sound of boots. Auri went startled and still. She closed her hand over Foxen and sat all quiet in the sudden dark, straining to hear. But no, there was nothing. The underthing was host to 1,000 small moving things, water in pipes, wind through billows, the rumbling thrum of wagons filtering through the cobblestones, half-heard voices echoing down the grates. But no boots. Not now. Not yet. She uncovered Fox and went to look at the leak again. The air was still hot and thick with wet, so she went back to her sitting place where there was nothing to do but fidget for a worry. Auri considered running back to fetch the brazen gear. Then at least she would have comfort. But no, she had to stay. A leak was bad, but a leak might go unnoticed for some time. Now, with the water to this piece of pipe turned off entire, there was every chance that something vital up above was all alack. No knowing what. The pipe could lead to some disused piece of mains where it could stay dry for years with no one anyways the wiser. But perhaps it led to the Master's Hall, and right now one of them was halfway through a bath. What if it led to Crucible, and some experiment left to calmly calcinate was instead undergoing unintended exothermic full cascade? It led to the same thing. Upset. Folk finding keys, folk opening doors, strangers in her underthing shining their unseemly lights about. Their smoke, the braying of their voices, tromping everywhere with hard, uncaring boots, looking at everything without a single thought of what a look entails, poking things and messing them about without the slightest sense of what was proper. Auri realized her fists were knots of knuckle white. She shook herself and stood. Her hair hung lank around her head. The air was clearer now. Not wet and steaming anymore. She gathered up her tools and was glad to see the steam pipe had finally roasted both itself and everything around it dry. Better still, the slow regard of silent things had wafted off the moisture in the air. Auri brought Foxen close to the black iron pipe and was relieved to see the trouble was no greater than a hair-thin crack. Though the pipe looked dry, she wiped it with her handkerchief, wiped it again. Then she unstoppered the bottle, dipped her brush, and spread clear liquid all across the tiny break. Wrinkling her nose at the knife-like smell, Auri dipped her brush again, painting all around the pipe. She grinned and eyed the bottle. It was lovely. Tenaculum was tricky stuff, but this was perfect. Not thick like jam, not thin like water. It clung and stuck and spread. It was full of green grass and leaping and sulfonium? Naphtha? Hardly what she would have used, but you couldn't argue with results. The craft employed was undeniable. Soon she had coated the entire pipe around the crack in glistening liquid. She licked her lips, looked up, then worked her mouth and spat delicately onto the far edge of the wet. The surface of the tenaculum rippled, and her grin grew wider. She reached out a finger and was pleased to find it hard and smooth as glass. Oh yes, whoever wrought and factored this was living proof that alchemy was art. It showed pure mastery of craft. Auri painted 2 more coats, laving all way round the pipe, and for a handspan off beside the hairline crack. Twice more, back to set and then she stoppered up the bottle, kissed it, smiled, and sprinted back to turn the water on. duty done, Auri tended to the brush and headed back to Tenants. She pressed her ear against the door. Listened. She heard a faint... No. Nothing. She held her breath and listened. Nothing. Even so, she opened the door slowly. She looked inside to see there was no light around the other door. For a moment her heart stuttered as she thought she saw new boot prints on. But no. Just shadow. Just her own breath-catching fear. Carefully she put the bottle back upon its shelf, setting it inside its own dark, dustless ring where she had found it. And then the brush. She stepped carefully inside the big black brutish treadings of the boots. She wasn't one for rucking things about. She stepped the way the water moves within a gentle wave. Never mind the motion, the water stays unchanged. That was the proper way of things. She slowly closed the heavy door behind her. She checked the latch to make herself most certain sure. Stepping back into the underthing, the stones should have been sweet beneath her feet, but they were not. They were mere stone. The air seemed strange and strained. Something was wrong. She stopped and listened at the door again. She listened closer, then opened up the door a crack to peer inside. Nothing. She closed the door and checked the latch. She leaned her weight against the door and tried to sigh, but could not find the breath for it inside her chest. Something was wrong. She had forgotten something. Auri ran back to room, heart stuttering as she turned wrong. Then wrong again. But then she found the valve again. She went down on her knees to make herself most certain sure she'd turned it open and not closed. She put both hands upon the pipe and felt the tremble of the water running through. Not that. But still, had she moved carefully enough? Had she left a smudge upon the floor? Auri sprinted back to Tenants and put her ear against the door. Nothing. She opened the door and lifted Foxen high so that his light shone down onto the dust. Nothing. By now her skin was all asheen with sweat. She closed the heavy door. She checked the latch and leaned her slender weight against it, pressing with her hands and forehead. She tried to breathe more deeply, but her heart was stiff and tight inside her chest. There was something wrong about the air. The door refused to sit right in its frame. She pressed against it with both palms. She checked the latch. Foxen's light seemed suddenly too thin. Had she moved carefully enough? No, she knew. She listened, then opened up the door and looked again. Nothing. But simply seeing did not help. She knew that seeming wasn't hardly half of things. Something was wrong. She tried, but she could simply not unclench. She could not catch her breath. The stones beneath her feet were nothing like her stones. She needed to get somewhere safe. Despite the stones, the strangeness in the air, Auri started walking back to me. She took the safest way, but even so her steps were slow, and even so she sometimes had to stop and close her eyes and merely breathe, and even so the breathing hardly helped. How could it when the air itself had gone untrue? The angles were all wrong in Pickering, but she didn't realize how lost she had become until she looked around and found herself in Scaperling. She did not know how she had come to be so out of place, but there was no denying where she was. The damp was all around. The smell of rock, the grit under her feet, the way the walls were leering. She turned and turned again, but could not find her place. She tried to push ahead. She knew that if she walked and turned and walked, eventually she must leave grim, gritty Scaperling behind. She would come out into a friendly place, or at least a place that did not twist and cramp and loom all round her. So she walked and turned and looked around, hoping beyond hope for a glimpse of the familiar, hoping that the stones might slowly start to belong underneath her feet. But no, The hammer of her heart told her to run. She needed her safe place. She needed to get back to Mantle. But where was the whale? Even if she knew the way, the air was growing tight and dizzy all around her. Though she was loath to touch them, Aori stretched her hand to lean against the sharp unkindness of the wall. Slow steps, a turn. She smiled to see things open up ahead of her. Finally, her chest began to loosen up when finally she saw the end of scapeling ahead. She took 2 steps before she realized what way it offered out. She stopped. No. The tangle of unwelcome tunnel opened up ahead, but it opened out into the vast and empty quiet of Black Door. Aori did not even turn around. She merely took step after slow and sliding step back the same way she had come. It was hard. The wall caught at her hand and worried her, scraping skin off of her knuckles. The damp, tight knot of stapling did not want her back inside. The Black Door. The wide and welcome path to Black Door stretched before her like a dark, black, open mouth. A maw. Step after step, she forced her way backward into space. She did not dare to let the way to Black Door out of sight. She did not dare let it behind her, all unseen, unseemly, all unseen. Finally, she backed around a corner and sat trembling to the floor. She needed everything to not come all apart around her. She needed to get back to Mantle. She needed her most perfect place. There the stones were safe under her feet. There everything was sweet and proper true. She was dizzy and askance and slumped. She shook and could not bring herself to stand, so she folded herself in and sat cross-legged upon the floor. She sat there for a long and silent while. She closed her eyes. She closed her mouth. She covered Foxen with her hand. All small she sat, all still. The grubby dank of scapeling got in her hair, made it hang heavy. She let her tangleness fall all around her in a curtain. It made a tiny space inside. It was a small space just for her. Aori opened up her eyes and looked into this tiny private place. She saw brave Foxen bravely shining in the shelter of her hands. She uncovered him, and even though his light was thin and thready, the sight of him in this small space made Aori smile. She felt around inside herself for her true perfect name, and though it took a long and lonely moment, finally she felt it. She was shivering, scared, skinny. Just around the edges, it was still sizzling. It was still hers. Gone. Moving slowly, Aori stood and made her slow way out of scapeling. The air was thick and shuddersome. The walls were full of spikes. The stones begrudged her every step. Everything was snarling all parts. But even so, she found her way to Pickering. The walls were merely sullen.
Charge forward.
Then she made her way to Dunning's. Then Aori finally felt the stones of Mantle underneath her feet. She lightly stepped inside her almost perfect place. She washed her face and hands and feet. It helped. She sat for a long moment in her perfect chair. She enjoyed her perfect leaf. She breathed the lovely ordinary air. Her skin no longer felt stretched tight. Her heart grew buttery and warm. Foxen was fulsome again, even effulgent. Aori went to Van and brushed her hair until the damp and tangle were all gone. She drew a breath and sighed it out. Her name was sweet inside her chest. All things were in their proper place again. After taking a moment for her leisure, Haori got a drink of water from the pool in Moat, then headed back down to gather up the brazen gear. It was patient as 3 stones, but still it deserved to find its proper place as much as anyone. For lack of any better ideas, Haori carried it down to Wayne's. Perhaps it belonged there. Or better yet, perhaps the brazen thing might hint to her of what the tiny, hidden wrongness was that kept the sitting room from ringing sweetly as a bell. Or perhaps she might see the gear in a better light down there. Especially with the place so new and nearly perfect. It was as good a place as any, she supposed. So down she went to proper, rich, wood-paneled Wayne's. Then into her new sitting room. She sat the brazen gear upon the couch and curled up close beside it, tucking her feet underneath her. It wasn't any more content. Haori sighed and cocked her head at it. Poor thing. To be so lovely and so lost. To be all answerful with all that knowing trapped inside. To be beautiful and broken. Haori nodded and lay her hand gently on the gear's smooth face consolingly. Perhaps full bottom. Why hadn't she thought of that before? True, when she thought of love and answers, the ancient wreckage in the cavern hardly sprang to mind, but maybe that was just the point. Perhaps some long-dead, hulking Mechanata was in desperate need of 9 bright teeth and love in its abandoned heart. Haori ran one finger down its side, her skin snagging a little on the jagged edge where its 10th tooth was torn away. That's when it struck her like a thunderclap. She knew exactly what was wrong. Of course. She leapt up to her feet, grinning excitedly. She pulled the corner of the carpet up, rolling it until she saw the button laying there, content. Her hands flew to her pockets, looking for... Yes! Haori set the tarnished buckle down beside the button. She nudged it closer, turned it. There. She trembled slightly as she put the carpet back in place. She smoothed it flat with both her hands. She came to her feet and there was a click inside her like a key inside a lock. The room was perfect as a circle now, like a bell, like the moon when it was perfect full. Haori laughed in delight, and every piece of the laughing was a tiny bird come tumbling out to fly around the room. She stood in the center of the room and spun in a circle to see it all. And when her eyes passed over the ring on the table, she saw it no longer belonged here. It was free to go as it pleased. It sang golden all through itself, and the amber it held was gentle as an autumn afternoon. Brimming with joy, Haori danced, her bare feet white against the moss-soft darkness of the carpet. Her heart tumbling happily within her, Haori gathered up the brazen gear again, smiling as her hands closed around it. She was barely halfway back to Mantle when she heard a hint of music. Haori went as motionless as stone, silent as the stillness in a heart. It couldn't be. Not yet. She had days and days. She wasn't nearly... She heard again, faint. A sound that could have been the chime of glass on glass, that might have been a bird, but that might also be the distant singing of a tight, stretched string. He was here, days early, and her half-smudged and empty-handed both. But even so, her heart stepped sideways in her chest at the thought of seeing him again. Haori sprinted back to Mantle faster than a rabbit with a wolf behind. She took the fastest way, even though it went through Faceling with its damp and fear and the horrid smell of hot flowers hanging in the air. Back in Mantle, she set the brass gear up above the fireplace. Then Haori washed her face and hands and feet. She shucked herself and donned her favorite dress. Then, quivering with nervous excitement, she hurried into port and eyed the shelves. Not the bone, of course, not the book either, not yet. She put 2 fingers on the crystal, picked it up, turned it over. She breathed, tasting the air. She put it down again. She shifted foot to foot and glanced into Mantle. Her perfect yellow leaf was almost right. The brazen gear was sullen now and much too proud. He had enough of that. There was her newfound ring of autumn gold. That was fine enough, surely, and it suited him, twice bright. But as a gift it was foreboding. She did not wish to hint at him of demons. Then she spied the small jar, mouth open. Her eyes flicked over to the other shelf with its scattering of hollyberry, bright as blood upon the cloth. Excitement welled up in her chest. She grinned. She grabbed the berries and funneled them into the tiny bottle. They fit perfectly, of course. They were dutiful and true. Holly bottle. To keep him safe. An early visit. Music. It was more makeshift than she liked, barely proper, but truth be told, he was the early one. It was sufficient for an early visit. She darted out the door, her feet tap-tapping all the way through Grimsby, then down Oars, and finally up to Trip Beneath. Owry paused there, underneath the heavy drainage grate. Her heart hammered as she tried to listen. Nothing. Had she really heard? Was he waiting? Had she dithered until he had grown bored and left? She put Foxon in his tiny box, then worked the hidden catch and pushed against the heavy iron bars above with trembling arms. The grate swung wide and Owry clambered up to Apple Court, sheltered by the hedges there. She went still, listened. No voices. Good. No light in the windows. Good. The moon was looking into Apple Court. Not a good moon. Owry looked out from the safety of the hedge, peering at the sky. No clouds. She closed her eyes and listened again. Nothing. She took a deep breath and darted through the open grass to stand beneath the sheltering branches of Lady Larble. There she stopped to breathe, going still as steady. After looking round again, she scampered up the twisty branches. It was tricky with the holly bottle in one hand. She slipped a little, rough bark scritching at the bottoms of her feet. Then she was on top of things. She could see everything and forever. All of Temerant spooled endlessly away beneath her feet. It was so nice she almost didn't care about the moon. She could see the prickly chimblies of Crucible and winged mews all full of flicker light. To the east she spied the silver line of the old stone road cutting gully deep into the forest, off to Stonebridge, over the river, and away, away, away. But he wasn't here. There wasn't anything. Just warm tar under her feet, and chimblies, and the sharpness of the moon. Owry clutched the holly bottle in her hand. She looked around and beckoned to the shadow of a brick tree gently so the moon could watch her. She held her breath and listened. Maybe if she rested. She looked around. The wind huffed by and swirled her hair around her face. She brushed it back, frowning. He wasn't here. Of course he wasn't. He wasn't coming till the 7th day. She knew the way of things. Owry stood there motionless, her hands close to her chest. She held the holly bottle. Her eyes flicked about the moon-swept rooftops. She sat cross-legged on the tin in the shadow of Brickery. She looked around. She waited. pleasant place. Eventually, a cloud hid the moon. Smug thing. And Auri took the chance to scamper back into the underthing. Her heart was heavy all the way through tenors, but she found a large tangle of dry wood and iron washed down the grates in some forgotten store. Ash and elm and hawthorn. So much wood it took 6 trips to carry all of it to Mantle. It was quite a find, and by the end of it she was near to whistling. Auri washed her soaking hands and feet, smiling at the smell of her yet more slender sliver of sweet soap. She donned her second favorite dress again. It was still a doing day. After filling her pockets and picking up her gather sack, she made her way to Mandrill. She didn't even need to wet her feet, as there hadn't been a heavy rain in ages. At the farthest tail of the twisting way, Auri stopped before the final corner. There was a hint of moonlight up ahead, so she gave Foxen a quick kiss before tucking him inside his tiny wooden box. She took the final piece of Mandrill more by memory than sight, stepping carefully until she stood behind the upright runoff grate that looked out onto nothing much except the bottom of a gully. Auri moved to stand next to the heavy bars. From there she saw the bulk of Haven up upon the hill, a shadow looming large against the starry sky. A few lights burned in windows, some red, some yellow, and one up on the topmost floor a bright and chilling blue. She held her breath then. No voices, no hooves, no howling. She looked up and saw the stars, the moon, and a few slender shreds of cloud. She watched the cloud scrap slowly scull across the sky. She waited till it hid the slender moon. Only then did Auri work the hidden latch inside the grate so it swung open like a door. Then she scurried up the gully, across a stretch of well-groomed lawn, and ducked into the shadows underneath the spreading oak. She stood there, motionless a while until her heart stopped beating, until she was most certain sure that she had not been seen. Then Auri edged around the tree until the building could no longer see her. And after that, she turned and disappeared into the woods. Auri found the place while picking pine cones, a small, forgotten graveyard, stones overgrown with ivy. Roses ran wild, climbing the remains of an ancient wrought iron fence. Arms close to her body, hands beneath her chin, Auri stepped into the graveyard. Her tiny feet were silent as she moved among the stones. The moon was out again, but she was lower now and bashful. Auri smiled at her, glad for the company now that she was no longer on top of things and Haven was far gone behind. Here on the edge of the clearing, the moon showed acorns scattered on the ground. Auri spent a few minutes picking up the ones with perfect hats and tucking them into her dress. She strolled between the stones, stopping at a broken one, the letters worn away with rain and age. She touched it with 2 fingers and moved on. She lifted up the ivy on the monument, then turned to see the laurel tree that loomed in the far corner of the yard. Its roots were all among the stones, its branches spread above. It was a lonely thing, all odd and out of place. Stepping close, her small feet fitting neatly in between the roots, Auri pressed her hand against the tree's dark trunk. She breathed in deep the warm scent of its leaves. She slowly circled it and spied a dark gap down among the roots. Nodding, Auri reached into her gather sack and brought out the bone that she had found the day before. She bent down and tucked it deep inside the dark and hollow space beneath the floor. She smiled with satisfaction. Standing, she dusted off her knees and stretched. Then she began to pick the small blue laurel fruit and put them in her gather sack. She explored the forest after that. She found a mushroom, which she ate. She found a leaf and breathed on it. She looked up at the stars. Later still, Auri crossed a creek she'd never seen before and was surprised to find a tiny farmhouse tucked among the trees. Surprised, but pleased. It was a seemly place, all stone, with slate upon its pointed roof. On the back porch near the door there was a small table. A wooden plate covered with an overturned wooden bowl rested there. Beside it was a bowl of clay covered with a glazed clay plate. Auri lifted the wooden bowl and found a piece of fresh brown bread beneath. It held health and hearts and half, a lovely thing and full of invitation. She put it in her pocket. She knew the other bowl held milk, but the plate that covered it face up. It was not for her. She left it for the people. Keeping in the shadow, Auri made her way around the garden to the barn. There was a strange dog there, all gristle and bay. It massed half again as much as her, its shoulders coming nearly to her chest. It stepped out of the shadows when she came close to the barn. It was black, with a thick neck and scars all across its face. One ear was ragged and chewed from some forgotten fight. It padded closer to her, massive head held low, moving suspiciously from side to side, eyeing her. Auri grinned and held out her hand. The dog snuffled at her, then licked her fingers before making a great gulp of a yawn and settling down to sleep. The barn was huge, stone below with painted wood above. The doors were closed and fastened with a fat iron paddock lock, but high above, the hayloft was thrown wide to greet the night. Auri climbed the ivy-knotted stone as quickly as a squirrel. She went slower up the second half, the barn boards followed past her fingers and her feet. The barn was full of musk and sleep, dark too, save for a few thin bands of moonlight slanting through the wooden walls. Auri opened Foxen's tiny box, and his blue-green light welled out to fill the open space. An old horse nuzzled Auri's neck as she walked by his side. She smiled at him and took the time to brush his tail and mane. There was a pregnant nanny goat which bleated out a greeting. Auri scooped some grain into her trough. There was a clap. They ignored each other. Auri spent some time there looking through everything. Limestone, the quern, the small, well-fitted churn, a bare skin stretched upon a rack to cure. It was a quite uncommon, pleasant place. Everything was tended to and loved. Nothing she could see was lost or lost. Well, near nothing. Even the tightest ship let slip a little bit. A single turnip had gone tumbling from its bin to lie abandoned on the floor. Auri put it in her gather sack. There was a large stone sweat box, too. It was stacked with slabs of ice, each thicker than a cinder brick and twice as long. Inside, she found butchered meat and sweet cream butter. There was a lump of suet in a bowl, a sheet of honeycomb upon a tray. The suet was enraged. It was a swarm of autumn apples, age, and anger. It wanted nothing more than to be on its way. She tucked it deep inside her bag. Oh, but the honeycomb, it was lovely. Not one bit stale. The farmer loved the bees and did things in the proper way. It was full of silent bells and drowsy summer afternoons. Auri felt inside her pocket. Her fingers passed over the crystal of a small stone doll. The rock wasn't proper for this place either. She reached inside her gather sack and felt around among the acorns she'd collected. For a long moment, it seemed like nothing she had brought would make a proper fit. But then her fingers found it and she knew. Carefully, she brought out the length of fine white tatted lace. She folded it and left it near the churn. It was the careful work of many long and drowsy autumn days. It would find purpose in a place. Then Aoi took the clean white cloth that had held the hollyberry earlier and rubbed it with some butter. Then she broke off a piece of sticky cone with the side of her spread hand and wrapped it up as tidy as can be. She would have loved to have some butter too, as hers was full of knives. There were 11 squared-off pats of it lined up upon the sweatbox shelf, full of clover and birdsong and, oddly, sullen hints of clay. Even so, they were all lovely. Aoi searched her gather sack and looked through all her pockets twice, but in the end she still came up last. She closed the sweatbox tightly, then up the ladder to the open window of the loft. She put Foxen away, then made her slow way down the side of the barn, gather sack slung tight across her back. On the ground, Aoi brushed her floating hair out of her face, then kissed the hulking dog atop his sleeping head. She skipped around the corner of the barn and took a dozen steps before the prickle on her neck told her that she was being watched. She froze mid-step, gone still as stone. Touched by the wind, her hair moved of its own accord, slowly drifting to surround her face as gently as a puff of smoke. Moving nothing but her eyes, Aoi saw her. Up on the second floor, in the blackness of an open window, Aoi saw a pale face even smaller than her own. A little girl was watching her, eyes wide, a tiny hand against her lap. What had she seen? Foxen's green light shining through the slat, Aori's tiny shape obscured by hair like this, barefoot in the moonlight. Aori's sudden smile was hidden by the curtain of her hair. She did a cartwheel then, her first in ages, her fine hair following a comet tail. She cast her eyes around and saw a tree, a dark hole in its trunk. Aoi danced toward it, twirling and leaping, then bent to look inside the hole. Then, her back to the farmhouse, Aoi opened Foxen's box and heard a single tiny gasp thread through the silent night behind her. She pressed one hand against her mouth so that she wouldn't laugh. The hole was perfect, just deep enough so that a little girl could reach inside and feel around. If she were curious, that is. If she were brave enough to stick her arm in nearly to her shoulder. Aoi pulled the crystal from her pocket. She kissed it, brave explorer it was, and lucky too. It was the perfect thing. This was the perfect place. True, she was no longer in the underthing, but even so, this was so true it could not be denied. She wrapped the crystal in a leaf and lay it in the bottom of the hole. Then she ran into the trees, dancing, leaping, giggling high and wild. She went back to the boneyard then, and climbed atop a large, flat slab, back straight and smiling. Aoi made a proper dinner for herself with soft brown bread with just a bit of honey. For afters she had pine nuts, fresh picked from their cones, each one a tiny, perfect treat. All the while her heart was brimming, her grin was brighter than the slender crescent moon. She licked her fingers too, as if she was some tawdry thing, all wicked and unseemly. Hollow. On the third day, Aoi wept. The Angry Dark. When Auri woke on the fourth day, things had changed. She could tell before she stretched awake, before she cracked her eyes into the seamless dark. Foxen was frightened and full of mountains, so today was a tapering day, a birding day. She didn't blame him. She knew what it could be like. Some days simply lay on you like stones. Some were fickle as cats, sliding away when you needed comfort and coming back later when you didn't want them, jostling you, stealing your breath. No, she didn't blame Foxen, but for half a minute she wished it was a different sort of day, even though she knew that nothing good could come from wanting, even though she knew it was a wicked thing to do. Even so, burning days were flickersome, too frangible by half. They were not good days for doing, they were good days for staying put and keeping the ground steady underneath her feet. But she only had 3 days left. There was still so much to do. Moving gently in the dark, Auri picked up Foxen from his. He fairly smouldered with fear. There would be no persuading him like this. So she gave him a kiss and returned him to his property. Then she made her way out of bed under the terrific blanket of the full and heavy dark. It made no difference if her eyes were open, so she left them closed while her hands sought out her cinder box. She left them closed while she brought out matches and a candle. She dragged a match against the floor where it spittered, sparked, then broke. Her heart sank. A bad start for a bad day. The second match hardly sparked at all, just gritted. The third snapped. The fourth flared and faded. The fifth ground itself down into nothing. And that was all of them. Auri sat for a moment in the dark. It had been like this before sometimes. Not for a long time now, but she remembered. She'd been sitting like this, empty as eggshell, hollow and chest-heavy in the angry dark when she'd first heard him playing, back before he'd given her the sweet, new, perfect name, a piece of sun that never left her. It was a bite of bread, a flower in her heart. Thinking of this made it easier for her to stand. She knew the way to her bed table. The basin had fresh water. She would wash her face and hands. But there was no soap. She'd used the last of it, and all her other cakes were off where they belonged. She sat down on the floor again beside her bed. She closed her eyes. She almost stayed there too, all cut-string and tangle-haired and lonely as a button. But he was coming. He would be here soon, all sweet and brave and shattered and kind. He would come carrying and clever-fingered and oh so unaware of oh so many things. He was rough against the world, but even so, 3 days. He would come visiting in 3 short days, and for all her work and wonder, she hadn't found a proper present for him yet. For all that she was wise about the way of things, she hadn't caught an empty echo of anything that she could bring. No proper gift, no nothing yet to share. It simply wouldn't do. So Auri gathered herself in and climbed up slowly to her feet. There were 3 ways out. The hallway was dark, the doorway was dark, the door was dark and closed. So without friends or anyone to guide her, Auri made her slow and careful way out through the hallway, trekking trees. She went through candle bare, her fingers brushing the wall lightly so she could find her way. She took the long way round, as Volks was far too dangerous. Then halfway through Pickering, she stopped and turned around for fear that she would find the Black 12 ahead. The air above as dark and still and chill as the pools below, she could not bear the thought of that today. That meant there was no way for her but damp and mouldy scapeling instead. And if that weren't enough, the only proper way through Dunnings was unnecessarily narrow and all athwart with webs. They got in her hair, which made her sticky and soft. But eventually she found her way to a tree. The tiny tickling sound of running water in the cold well came to greet her, and it was only then that she remembered how hungry she was. She found her few remaining matches on the shelf and lit her spirit lamp. The sudden brightness of it hurt her eyes, and even after she recovered, the yellow jumping flame made everything look strange and anxious. She put the 5 remaining matches in her pocket and took a drink of water from the cold well. The shelves looked more empty than usual in the odd jittery light. She rinsed her hands and face and feet in the icy water. Then she sat down on the floor and ate the turnip in small bites. Then she ate her last remaining fig. Her tiny face was grave. The smell of nutmeg prickled in the air. All flickering and sticky with web, Auri made her way to bakery. It wasn't oveny today. It was hunkered down and sullen like a forgotten kiln. She passed the mellow pipes and turned again before she made her way to the little bricky niche, so perfect for her hoard of soap to season in, not hot, but dry, and there was no soap. Her soap was gone. But no, it was the shifting light from the spirit lamp tricking her, all odd and yellow. It threw shadows everywhere. It changed the underthing. It couldn't be trusted. This was obviously a different little bricky niche, empty as anything. She turned around and followed her own footsteps back to Ember. Then she went back, counting turns, left and right, left, then right. No, this was bakery. This was her niche. But there was nothing there. No burlap sack, no careful cakes of perfect summer soap. Even in the glowing red radiant of that place, Auri felt ice in her belly. Was someone in her underthing? Was someone moving things about? Rucking up the smoothness of all her long, hard years of work? All watery and loose inside, she searched about, peering around corners and shining her lamp into shadows. Barely 10 feet away, she found her burlap sack torn to tatters. Underneath the scent of her sweet sinner soap was the smell of musk and piss. There was a tuft of fur, where some small climbing beast had rubbed itself against a jutting brick. Auri stood, all tangle-haired and sticky. Her tiny face was stunned at first, numb in the flickering yellow. Then her mouth grew furious. Her eyes went hard. Something had eaten all her perfect soap. Reaching out, she took the tuft of fur between her fingers. The gesture was so tight with rage, she feared she'd snap and crack the world in two. 8 cakes, an entire winter's worth of soap. Something had eaten all the perfect soap she'd made. It dared come here, into the proper place for soap, and eat it all. She stamped her foot. She hoped the greedy thing shit for a week. She hoped it shit its awful self inside out and backward, then fell into a crack and lost its name and died alone and hollow empty in the angry dark. She threw the tuft of fur down on the floor. She tried to run her fingers through her hair, but they snagged up in her tangles. For a second, her hard eyes went all rimful. She blinked them back. Hot from bakery and all asweat with rage and the unrightness of it all, Auri turned and stormed away, her bare feet slapping angrily against the stone. Heading back to Mantle, Auri took the shorter way, all draggled and snatched in an effort to dunk herself in the pool at the bottom of the sea, and felt a little better for it. It was no kind of proper bath, a dip, a rinse, and chilly, but better than nothing, if only just. The moon peered faintly through the great above, but but she was kind and distant, so Auri didn't mind. Getting out of the water, she shook herself and rubbed her damp skin with her hands. She couldn't think of going back to the bakery to dry, not today. She eyed the moonlight peering in the grates above and had just begun to squeeze the water from her hair when she heard it. A tiny splashing, a tiny mewling squeak, the sound of distress. She dashed around in a long moment of panic. Sometimes a lost thing found its way down to the bottom of the 12 and fell into the pool while drinking. It took a breathless time to find it. Her damned awful flicker seemed to shed more shadow than it burned away, and echoes came from everywhere, scattered by the pipes and water of the silver 12. So ears were hardly any help at all. Finally, she found it. A tiny thing, mewling and babbling. It was the next thing to a baby, barely old enough to be out on its own. Auri took hold of a hanging brace and leaned out long across the water, one leg lifting up for balance, while her other arm went out above her head. She stretched like a dancer. Her hand described a gentle arc and dipped into the pool, gently scooping the tiny, draggled thing up. And it bit her. It sunk its teeth into the meaty bit between her finger and her thumb. Auri blinked and pulled herself back to the edge, cupping the small skunk gently in her hand. It struggled, and she was forced to grip it tighter than she liked. If it fell into the pool again, it might gasp and drown before she found and fetched it out. Once both her feet were back upon the stone, Auri made a cage for the tiny skunk, with both her hands against her chest. With no hands left to hold her lamp, Auri trusted to the moonlight as she scurried up old ironways. It squirmed and scratched at her chest, fighting to be free, biting her a second time on the tip pad of her smallest finger. But by then she'd reached the nearest grate. She lifted up her hand and nudged the poor lost thing outside, out of the underthing and back toward its proper nighttime place of mothers, bins, and cobblestones. Auri made her way back to the bottom of the silver 12 and ducked her throbbing hand into the pool. It stung quite badly, but truthfully it was her feelings that were worst hurt. It had been a mortal age since anything had been so rude to her. Her name hung dark and heavy in her chest as Auri dragged her dress on over her head. It didn't fit her properly today. It felt like everything was leering at her in the yellow light. Her hair was dreadful. Auri walked back to Mantle, taking the long way around to avoid vans so she wouldn't have to see herself in her mirror. Coming into port, she saw that nearly everything was wrong. Of course, it was just that sort of day. She set the lamp on the table harder than she needed to, making the flame jump high. Then she did her best to set the place to rights. Holly bottle, close beside the folded secrets of the all-uncut octavo book. No, by itself on the farthest edge of second shelf. The resin wanted its own space. The brimful jar of dark blue laurel fruit moved back onto the corner table. The tiny stone figurine perched high upon the wine rack, as if it was so much better than the rest of them. The only thing that kept its place was her new one perfect piece of honeycomb. She almost took a bite of it for no good reason other than to brighten up her day. She might have to, selfish as that would be, but she couldn't bear the thought of touching it, given the state that she was in. When things were squared away as well as she could manage, Auri took the lamp and stepped through into Mantle. Her cedar box was in a state of minor disarray, and there were broken matches strewn about, but both of those were good. The brazen gear was fine. Her box of stone, her ring of autumn gold, her grey glass bottle, all. She felt herself relaxed. Then she saw her blanket. Her perfect blanket she had made herself in her own. It had twisted in the corner, laying naked on the floor. But when she felt around inside herself, she found she had no crying left. She was full of broken glass and burrs. She was weary and disappointed with all of everything, and her hand hurt. But there was no crying left in her. So instead she gathered up her blanket and carried it to Billow. After searching out a clean brass pipe, she hung it like a curtain in the center of the tunnel, let the endless wind brush past, and watched it wicker gently back and forth. It billowed and luffed, but that was all. Auri frowned and moved to pull the blanket down again, but she was careless, and a puff of wind blew out her lamp. Relighting it cost her another precious match. Once Billows was full of flicker light again, Auri tugged the blanket down, turned it over, and hung it on the pipe again. But no. Front ways or back ways, it didn't make a lick of difference. Next, she climbed old ironways and found the grate that loved the moon the most. Her pale light feathered down like snowdrops, like a silver spear. Auri spread the blanket out to catch the moon, to bask in it. It didn't help. She carried the blanket backward through the whole of Winnoway. She took it to the top of drafting, threw it off, and watched it plummet through the maze of wires until it snagged one near the bottom, and hung there, bobbing gently up and down. She carried it back to Mantle and wrapped it round the horrid, galling, stubborn, brazen gear that stood there gloating and golden in the flickering light. None of it did a bit of good. Unable to think of anywhere else that might help ease the offence, Auri carried the blanket all the way down to Wayne's and into her new perfect sitting room. She draped it over the back of the couch. She folded it and set it in the chair. Finally, in true desperation, Auri set her jaw and spread her blanket flat across the lush red rug in the center of the room. She smoothed it with both hands, careful not to let it touch the stone of the floor. It overlapped the rug almost perfectly, and for a second she felt hope rise in her chest that... But no, it didn't fix things at all. She knew it then. She'd known all along, really. Nothing was going to make the blanket right again. Scowling, Auri snatched the blanket up, wadded the ungrateful thing into a ball, and headed up the unnamed stair. She felt flat and scraped as an old hide, dry as paper written on both sides. Even the playful teasing of the new stone stair could stir no breath of joy in her. She climbed over the debris, through the broken wall, and into Tumbrel. The room looked different in the yellow flickering, full of looming fear and disappointment. And when her eyes passed over the vanity, she saw it differently. It was not rakish now. In the shifting light, she saw it had a sinister bent and caught a glimpse of what was turning it from true. She could feel the tattered edges of its disarray. But tangle-haired and sticky, all unwashed and hollow as she was hardly in the proper state for mending. She was in no mood to tend to the ungrateful thing. Instead, Auri knelt before the wardrobe and set the spirit lamp beside her. Her knees were chilly on the stone floor as she pulled open the drawer and looked down at the creamy folded sheets inside. Auri closed her eyes. She took a long, stiff breath and sighed it out again. Eyes still closed, she stuffed the blanket hard into the drawer. Then she lay her hand upon the topmost sheet. Yes, this was Faire. Even blind, she could sense the sweetness of it. Her fingers trailed across the creamy surface. She heard a tiny, frizzling noise and caught the scent of burning hair. Auri sprang back, scrabbling madly backward on all fours, away from the vicious spitting yellow flame. Catching hold of her hair, it was cold comfort to see only a few stray strands were charred. Auri stomped back to the wardrobe, snatched her blanket up, and slammed the drawer, too furious to even think of being properly polite. Then, climbing through the broken wall, Auri stubbed her toes against a jutting block of stone. She didn't drop her lamp, but it was a near thing. Instead, she merely cried in pain, staggering to catch her balance. Auri sat down hard upon the floor, clutching her foot. It was only then she realized she dropped her blanket. It was laying on the naked stone beside her. She grit her teeth so hard she feared that they would break. After a long moment, she gathered up her things, trudged back to port, and stuffed the blanket angrily into the wine rack. Since that's where it belonged now. Since that's the way things had to be. Auri spent a long time sitting in her thinking chair, glaring at the brazen gear. It was all glimmer and warm honey in the yellow light. She glared at it all the same, as if it were to blame, as if it were the one that made a mess of everything. Eventually, her sulk burned out. Eventually, she calmed enough to realize the truth. You couldn't fight the tide or change the wind, and if there was a storm, well, a girl should batten down and bail, not run the rigging. How could she help but make a mess of things the state that she was in? She'd strayed from the true way of things. First you set yourself to rights, and then your house, and then your corner of the sky, and after that, well, then she didn't rightly know what happened next, but she hoped that after that, the world would start to run itself a bit, like a gear watch, proper fit and kissed with oil. That was what she hoped would happen, because honestly, there were days she felt rubbed raw. She was so tired of being all herself, the only one that tended to the proper turning of the world. Still, it was sulk or sail. So Auri stood and rinsed her face and hands and feet. There was no soap, of course. It was no kind of proper wash. It didn't make her feel even a little better. But what else could she do? She brought the lamp to her lips and puffed out the yellow tongue of flame. Darkness flooded in to fill the room, and Auri climbed into her narrow, naked bed. Auri lay in the dark for a long while. She was tired and tangled and hungry and hollow. She was weary in her heart and head, but even so, sleep would not come. She thought it was the loneliness at first, or the chill that kept her gritty-eyed and shifty. Perhaps it was the dull ache of her twice-bit hand. But no, those were no less than she deserved. They were not enough to keep her all wide-eyed at night. She'd learned to sleep with worse than that. Back in the times before he'd come, back in the years before she had her sweet new perfect name. No, she knew what the problem was. She slid out of her bed and brought out one of her few matches. It struck on the first try, and Auri smiled white in the red light of its sulphurous flaring. She lit the spirit lamp and carried it to port. Guiltily, she removed her blanket from the wine rack where she'd stuffed it. She smoothed it gently out across the table, murmuring an apology, and she was sorry. She knew better. Cruelty never helped the turning of the world. She folded the blanket carefully then, her hands gentle. She matched the corners and kept it square and true. Then she found the proper place for it upon the bookshelf and brought the smooth grey stone so that it wouldn't want for company. It would be cold at night and she would miss it, but it was happy there. Didn't it deserve to be happy? Didn't everything deserve its proper place? Still, she cried a bit as she tucked the blanket in, settling it on the shelf. Auri made her way back into Mantle and sat on her bed. Then she went back to port to make sure her crying hadn't skewed things all about. But no, she brushed the blanket with her hands, comforting. It was as it should be. It was happy. Back in Mantle, Auri moved about the bare room, making sure everything was as it should be. Her thinking chair was just so. Her cedar box was flush against the wall. Foxen's dish and dropper jar were resting on the bed shelf. The brazen gear sat in its niche, indifferent to the world. The fireplace was empty, clean and trim. Her bedside table held her tiny silver cup. Above the fireplace on the mantelpiece sat her perfect yellow leaf, a small, strong box of stone, a grey glass jar with kind, dried lavender inside, her ring of sweet, warm autumn gold. Auri touched each of these, making sure of them. They were everything they ought to be and nothing else. They were fine as fine. Despite all of this, she felt unsettled, here in her most perfect place. Auri hurried down to Burra, brought back a broom, and set to sweeping Mantel's floor. It took an hour, not because of any mess, but Auri swept slowly and carefully, and there was quite a lot of floor. She didn't often think of it, because Mantel hardly needed mending before. It was hers, and the place loved her, and she fit here like a pea in her own perfect pot. But even so, there was a lot of the floor. The floor all fresh, Auri returned the room. On her way back, she wandered through port to check on the blanket. It seemed to be doing well, but she brought the holly bottle over to keep it company too, just in case. It was a terrible thing to be lonely. She stepped back into Mantle again and set the spirit lamp on her table. She took her 3 remaining matches out of her pocket and put them on the table too. As she sat on the edge of her bed, Auri realized what was out of place. She was herself in disarray. She'd seen something in Tumbrel and not tended to it. Auri thought of the 3 mirrored vanity, and a tickling finger of guilt ran itself along the edge of her heart. Even so, she was tired down in her bones now, weary and hurt. Perhaps just this once. Auri frowned and shook her head furiously. She was a wicked thing sometimes, all full of want, as if the shape of the world depended on her mood, as if she were important. So she stood and made her slow way back to Tumbrel, down Crumbledon, through Wains, through Circle Perfect Annulet, and up the unnamed stair. After climbing through the broken wall, Auri looked hard at the vanity in the flicker of light. As she did, she could feel her heart rise slightly in her chest. The shifting light against 3 mirrors, it made countless shadows dance across the bottles there. Stepping closer, Auri watched carefully. She would never have seen this properly without the shifting nature of the yellow light. She stepped left, then right, looking at things from both sides. She tilted her head. She went to her knees so that her eyes were level with the surface of the vanity. A sudden, sunny smile spilled all across her face. Back straight, Auri sat on the edge of the chair in front of the vanity. She tried not to look in the mirrors, knowing how she must appear. An unwashed, red-eyed, tangled mess. Too thin, too pale. She was no kind of lady. She opened the 2 drawers instead and stared at them for a moment, letting the yellow light and shadows slide around inside. After several minutes, Auri nodded to herself. She removed the pair of gloves from the right-hand drawer and set them near the mirror by a pot of rouge. Then Auri pulled the right-hand drawer completely free and switched it with the partner on the left. She sat there for a long moment, moving the drawers back and forth in their new tracks, a look of intent concentration on her. Everything atop was disarray, bottles and baubles strewn about. Despite that, nearly everything was just the way it ought to be. The only exception was the hairbrush, which Auri tucked into the left-hand drawer by the handkerchiefs, and a small golden brooch with 2 birds in flight, which cheated beneath the fan. After that, the only thing out of place was a delicate blue bottle with a twisted silver stopper. Like many of the other bottles, it was laying on its side. Auri set it upright, but that wasn't right. She tried to tuck it in a drawer. She picked it up, listening to the liquid tinkling inside. She looked around the room uncertainly. She opened the vanity's drawers again, then slid them closed again. There didn't seem to be a place for it. She shook the bottle ivy in her hand and tapped it with her fingernail. The pale blue glass was delicate as eggshell, but dusty. She gave the bottle a good polishing, hoping it might be a little more forthcoming. When it was clean, it gleamed like the heart of some forgotten icy god. Turning it over in her hands, she saw tiny letters etched across the bottom of it. They read, "For my intoxicating Esther." Ari put her hand across her mouth. The muffled giggle still escaped. Moving slowly, her expression thick with disbelief, she unscrewed the stopper and took a sniff. She laughed openly, then hugely from deep in her belly. She laughed so hard she could barely screw the top back on. She was still chuckling a minute later as she tucked the bottle deep into her pocket. She was still smiling when she made her careful way down the unnamed stair and put the bottle carefully away in port. It liked the bookshelf best, and that was doubly good, as there it would keep both Holly Bottle and the blanket company. Auri was still smiling when she climbed into her tiny, perfect bed, and yes, it was cold. And lonely too. But that could not be helped. She knew better than anyone. It was worth doing things away. Ash and Ember. When Auri woke on the 5th day, Foxen was quite recovered from his mood. That was for the best. She had a busy lot of work to do. Laying in the dark, she wondered what the day would bring. Some days were trumpet proud. They heralded like thunder. Some were courteous, careful as a lettered card upon a silver plate. But some days were shy. They did not name themselves. They waited for a careful girl to find them. This was such a day too shy to knock upon her door. Was it a calling day, a sending day, a making day, a mending day? She could not tell. As soon as Foxen was sufficiently unslumberous, Auri went to taps and fetched fresh water for her basin. Then back in mantle, she rinsed her face and hands and feet. There was no soap, of course. That was the very first of things that she would set to rights today. She was not vain enough to work her will against the world, but she could use the things the world had given her. Enough for soap. That was allowed. That was within her rights. First, she lit her spirit lamp. With Foxen's sweet cerulean to soften it, the yellow flame helped warm the room without filling it with frantic shadows, clawing at the walls, all jerk and shudder. Auri opened up the flue and set a careful fire with her newfound tanglewood, so fine and dry, all ash and elm and spry hawthorn. She soon set it crackling to life. She eyed it for a moment, then turned away. It would be burning for some time. It was just as Master Mandrag always said, 9/10 of chemistry was waiting. But she had work enough to fill the time. First, she ventured down to tree. She fetched the small copper kettle and her cracked clay cup. She pocketed the empty linen sack. She eyed the butter in the well, then frowned at it and shook her head, knowing better than to borrow trouble with the knives it held. She lifted out the hard white lump of suet instead, sniffed it curiously and grinned. Then she gathered up the tiny tripod all of iron. She took her sack of salt. She was just about to leave when she paused and eyed the silver bowl of nutmeg seeds. So strange and rare, so full of far away. She picked one up and ran her fingertips along its tippled skin. She brought it to her face and breathed in deep musk and thistle, a smell like a bordello curtain, deep and red and full of mysteries. Still uncertain, Auri closed her eyes and bent her head. The pink tip of her tongue flicked shyly out to touch the strange brown pitum. She stood there, still as still. Then, eyes closed, she brushed the smooth side of it soft across her lips. It was a tender, thoughtful motion. There was nothing like it. After a long moment, Auri's mouth spread into a wide, delighted smile. Her eyes went wide as lamps. Yes. It was the very thing. The leaf-etched silver bowl was heavy. Auri made a special trip and carried it two-handed back to the room. Next, she fetched the large stone mortar where it hunkered down, all lurking in the dark house. She went to Clinks and brought 2 bottles back. She searched the floor of tenors till she found a scattering of dry pine needles. She brought these back to Mantle too, and placed them at the bottom of the cracked clay cup. By then, the fire had faded into ashes. She swept them up. She placed them in the cracked clay cup and packed them tight. She went to rinse her sooty hands. She rinsed her face and feet. Auri set another fire and kindled it. She put the suet in the kettle. She hung the kettle by the fire to melt. She added salt. She grinned. She went down to tree again and brought back the acorns she had gathered and a wide, flat pan. She shelled the nuts and toasted them, jiggling them about in the pan. She sprinkled them with salt and ate them each by each. Some were bitter, some were sweet, some were hardly anything. That was just the way of things. After she'd eaten them all, she eyed the suet and saw it wasn't finished, not by half. So one by one she cracked the nutmeg seeds. She ground them in the old stone mortar. She ground them fine as dust and poured the dust into a jar. Crack and grind, crack and grind. The mortar was a grim thing, thuggish and terse. But after 2 days without a proper wash, Auri found it perfect suited to her mood. When she was finished grinding, Auri pulled the copper pot of melted suet off the fire. She stirred. She sieved the dottle off till there was nothing left but hot, sharp tallow. She set the copper pot aside to cool. She went to fetch fresh water from the proper copper pipe in Pickering. She filled the spirit lamp from a bright steel tap tucked tidily away in Borough. When she returned, the fire had died again. She swept the ashes up and pressed them down into the cracked clay cup. She rinsed her sooty hands. She rinsed her face and feet. She lit the fire a third and final time. Then Auri went to port and eyed her shelves. She brought the bottle of esters and set it near the fireplace with her tools. She brought the holly cloth. Next, she carried in the jar of dark blue laurel. But much to her chagrin, it wouldn't fit. No matter how she tried, the jar of laurel simply wouldn't let itself be settled with her tools, not even when she offered it the mantelpiece. Auri felt unfairly vexed. The laurel would have been ideal. She'd thought of it as soon as she'd awoke, and thought of soap. It would have fit like hand into a hand. She'd planned to mingle. But no, there was no place for it. That much was clear. The stubborn thing would simply not be easy. It exasperated her, but she knew better than to force the world to bend to her desire. Her name was like an echo of an ache in her. She was unwashed and tangled-haired. It would be nothing but pure folly. She sighed and brought the jar of dark blue fruit back to its shelf in port where it sat, self-centered and content. Then Auri sat upon the warm, smooth stones of Mantle. She sat before the fireplace, her makeshift tools laid out around her. The ashes in the cracked clay cup were just as they should, fine and soft. Oak would have made them too attractive. Birch was bitter, but this was a perfect mix. Ash and elm and hawthorn. They made a medley without melding or meddling. The ash was proud but not unseemly. The elm was graceful but not inappropriately apetalous, especially for her. And the hawthorn? Well, Auri blushed a bit at that. Suffice to say that apetalous or no, she was still a healthy young lady, and there was such a thing as too much decorum. Next, she brought out the bottle of Esther. They were terribly coy, full of stolen moments and the scent of Celis flowers. Perfect. Thieving was precisely what she needed here. The nutmeg was foreign and something of a stranger. It was brimful of sea foam. A lovely addition, essential. They were a cipher and a mystery, but that was not particularly troublesome to her. She understood some secrets must be kept. She peered into the cooling pot and saw the tallow starting to congeal. It hugged the kettle's edge, making a slender crescent like the moon. She grinned, of course. She had found it underneath the moon. It would follow the moon, waxing full. But looking closer, Auri's smile faded. The suet was clean and strong, but there were no apples in it anymore. Now it was brimming full of age and anger. It was a thunderstorm of rage. That wouldn't do at all. She could hardly lave herself with rage day after day, and with no laurel to keep it at bay. Well, she would simply have to draw the anger out. If not, her soak was worse than ruin. Auri went back into port and looked around. It was a fairly simple choice. She lifted up the honeycomb and took a single bite. She closed her eyes and felt herself go all goose prickle from the sweetness of it. She could not help but giggle as she licked it off her lips, almost dizzy from the work of bees inside. After she had sucked all of the sweetness from it, Auri delicately spat the lump of beeswax out into her palm. She rolled it in her hands until it made a soft, round bead. She gathered up the tallow pot and made her way to Umbra. The moon was motherly here, peering kindly through the drain. The gentle light feathered slantways down to kiss the stone floor of the underthing. Auri sat beside the circle of silver light and gently set the kettle in the center of it. The cooling tallow now formed a thin white ring around the inside of the copper kettle. Auri nodded to herself. 3 circles, perfect for asking. It was better to be gentle and polite. It was the worst sort of selfishness to force yourself upon the world. Auri tied the bead of beeswax to a thread and dipped it in the center of the still hot tallow. After several moments, she relaxed to see it working like a charm. She felt the rage congealing, gathering around the wax, heading to it like a bear on hunt for honey. By the time the circle of moonlight had left the copper pot behind, every bit of anger had been leached out of the tallow. As neat a factoring as ever hand of man had managed. Then Auri took the kettle off to tree and set it in the moving water of the chill well. Cricket quick the tallow cooled to form a flat white disc 2 fingers thick. Auri carefully lifted the disc of tallow off the surface and poured the golden water underneath away, noting idly that it held a hint of sleep and all the apples too. That was a pity, but it could not be helped. Such was the way of things sometimes. The bead of wax was seething. Now that the anger had been factored free, Auri realized it was much fiercer stuff than she had thought. It was fury, thunderous with untimely death. It was a mother's rage for cubs now left alone. Auri was glad the bead already dangled from a thread. She would be loath to touch it with her hands. Slow and quiet, Auri tucked the bead into a thick glass jar and sealed it with a tight, tight lid. This she carried off to Boundary. Oh, so careful she carried it. Oh, so careful she placed it on a high stone shelf, behind the glass. It would be safest there. In Mantle, Auri's third and final fire had fallen into ash. She swept it up again. These ashes filled the cracked clay cup to brimming. She rinsed her sooty hands. She rinsed her face and feet. All was ready. Auri grinned and sat down on the warm stone floor with all her tools arrayed around her. On the outside, she was all composed, but inside she was fairly dancing at the thought of her new soap. She set the kettle on the iron tripod. Underneath, she slid the spirit lamp so that the hot, bright flame could kiss the copper bottom of the kettle. First, there was her perfect disc of clean white tallow. It was strong and sharp and lovely as the moon. Part of her, restless piece, wanted to break the disc to bits so it would melt the faster. So she could have her soap the sooner. So she could wash herself and brush her hair and finally set herself to rights after so long. But no. She set the tallow gently in the kettle, careful not to give offense. She left it in its pure and perfect state, patience and propriety. It was the only graceful thing to do. Next came the ashes. She set the cracked clay cup atop a squat glass jar. She poured the clear, clean water over it. It filtered through the ash and trickled through the crack in the cup's bottom. It was the smoky red of blood and mud and honey. When the final drips had fallen, Auri held the jar of cinder wash aloft and saw it was as fine as any she had ever made. It was a sunset dusky red, stately and graceful. It was a changing thing. But underneath it all, the liquid held a blush of wantonness. It held all the proper things the wood had brought, and many caustic lies besides. In some ways, this would be enough. The tallow and the cinder wash would make a serviceable soap, but there would be no apples in it, nothing sweet or kind. It would be hard and pale as chalk. It would resemble bathing with an indifferent brick. So yes, in some ways, these would be enough for soap, but how awful would that be? How terrible to live surrounded by the stark, sharp hollowness of things that simply were enough. Sitting on the warm, smooth floor of Mantle, Auri shivered at the thought of moving through a joyless world like that. Nothing perfect, nothing beautiful and true. Oh no, she was too wise to live that way. Auri looked around and smiled at all her luxury. She had a perfect, loving leaf and lavender. She wore her favorite dress. Her name was Auri, and it was a shining piece of gold inside her all the time. So she twisted off the silver stopper from the ice blue jar and poured the perfume in among the well-ground nutmeg powder. The smell of sealess flower filled the room, so sweet and light against the prickle sting of nutmeg. Auri smiled and stirred the two together with a kindling stick, then poured the thick, wet, pulpy mass into the linen sack she'd set inside a wide-mouthed jar. She used 2 sticks to twist the ends of the sack, and her makeshift wringer squeezed the fabric tight until it oozed a thick, dark, oily liquid that spattered down into the jar. It was barely a slow trickle, just a spoonful of the liquid, 2 spoonfuls, 3. She turned the sticks, her mouth a line of concentration. The linen twisted tighter, the dark liquid welled up, gathered, dripped again. Despite herself, Auri wished she had a proper press. It was so wasteful otherwise. She strained against the sticks, shifting her grip and giving them another half a turn. She grit her teeth, her knuckles going white. Another drip. 3 more. 10. Auri's arms began to tremble, and despite herself, she glanced toward the iron-bound door that led to Boundary. She looked away. She was a wicked thing, but she was not so bad as that. Idle wishing was mere fancy. It was another thing entirely to bend the world toward her own desires. Finally, her shaking arms could bear no more. She sighed, relaxed, and pulled the sticks through, upended the linen sack into a challenge. No longer a dark, pulpy mass, the nutmeg goddess now looked pale. Auri lifted up the glass and eyed the viscous liquid, clear as amber. It was lovely, lovely, nothing that she'd ever seen before. It was thick with secrets and sea foam. It was prickle-rich with mystery. It was full of musk and whispers and tetradecanoic acid. It was so fine a thing she dearly wished for more of it. The jar hardly held a palmful. She glanced over at the pan and thought of squeezing out the pomace with her hands to gather up a few more precious drops. But reaching out, Auri found that she was oddly loath to touch the gritty mass with her own naked skin. She paused and tipped her head to look more closely at the pale, grey, crumbling pomace, and her stomach pulled into a knot at what she saw. It was full of screaming. Days of endless dark red screaming. It had been hidden by the mysteries before, but now the sealess sweet had stolen those away, and Auri saw the screaming clear as day. Auri lifted up the jar and eyed the amber bine, but no, it was just as she had seen before. There was no screaming hidden there among the mysteries and lists. It was still a perfect thing. Auri drew a long and shaky breath then, and setting down the jar, she gently laid the linen sack and both her twisting sticks inside the shallow tin pan beside the horrid tree. She handled them as little as she could, with nothing but her fingertips, as if they had been poison. She did not want it, no bit of it. She knew already, she knew of Red, she'd had enough of screaming. Sweating slightly, Auri lifted up the pan with both her hands and turned to face the doorway. Then she stopped before she took a single step toward well-ordered quarrel. She could not keep this there. Who knew what chaos it would bring? Screaming was no kind of kindly name. Auri turned toward the hallway then. She took a step, then stopped, not knowing where she'd go. To billows where the wind would carry screaming all throughout the underthing, to tree where it would smoulder like a coal, so near her pots and pans and precious pieces. But no, no, no. So Auri turned a final time. She turned to face the third way out of Mantle. She turned toward the iron-bound door and brought the linen to boundary. Returning, Auri rinsed her face. She rinsed her hands in full. She took one step toward the tripod and pulled it off, then stopped. She went back to her basin. She rinsed her face. She rinsed her hands in full. More than anything, she wanted to sit and finish what she had begun. She was so close. But first, she stepped off hurriedly to port to make herself quite sure of things. She smoothed the blanket with both hands. She touched the flat grey stone. She moved the holly bottle back where it belonged. She touched the leather book, then opened up the cover to make sure certain its pages were still all uncut. But glancing back toward the shelf, she saw the stone had gone. She tried to slide it back to proper truth, but couldn't see the shape of it and couldn't tell the way of things, and if it was a place where it was right. The honey, too. She wanted honey, but she mustn't. She rubbed her eyes, then forced herself to stop and look down at her hands. She hurried back to Mantle. She rinsed her face. She rinsed her hands and feet. She felt the panic rising in her then. She knew how quickly things could break. You did the things you could. You tended to the world for the world's sake. You hoped you would be safe, but still she knew. It had come crashing down and there was nothing you could do. And yes, she knew she wasn't right. She knew her everything was canted wrong. She knew her head was all unfit. She knew she wasn't true inside. She knew. Her breath was coming harder now, her heart a hammer in her chest. The light was brighter and she heard the sound of things that normally she couldn't hear. A keening of the world all out of place. A howl of everything all turned from true. Auri looked around the room, all startled sweat and fear. She was tangle and cut string. Even here, she could see traces. Mantle was all eggshell, even her most perfect place. Her bed was almost not her bed. Her perfect roof so frail. Her box of stones so far away. Her lavender no help at all and growing pale. She looked down at her shaking hands. Was she all full of screaming now? Again? No, it wasn't her. Not just. It was all everything unraveling and thin and tatter. She could not even stand. The light was jagged, scraping like a knife against her teeth, and underneath it was the hollow dark. The nameless, empty everything was clawing at the fraying edges of the wall. Even Foxen wasn't here. The stones were threatened. The air. She went looking for her name and couldn't even find it flickering. She was just hollow in. Everything was. Everything was everything. Everything was everything else. Even here in her most perfect place. She needed. Please. But there, against the wall, she saw the brazen gear was all unchanged. It was too full of love. Nothing shifted. Nothing could turn it from itself. When all the world was palimpsest, it was a perfect palindrome. Inviolate. It was all the way across the room. So far she feared she could not reach it, not with the stones below her gone so rough, not hollow as she was. But when she moved a bit, she saw it was not hard at all. It was downhill. The proud, bright, brazen gear was true enough. It pressed down hard against the thin, frayed tatter world and made a dent. Then she was touched. It was so smooth and all a sweat, breathless, desolate, pressed her forehead up against its rim. She took hold of it with both her hands. The sharpness of the edges on her palms was like a calming breeze. She clung to it at first, like someone in a shipwreck grips the stone of shore. But all the world around her was still storm, all tumble down, all crumble, pale and ache. And so with shaking arms she strained against it. She pulled to turn the gear upon its narrow ledge of rock. She spun it widdershins, the breaking way. It tipped from tooth to tooth. She spun the brazen gear, and only then did Auri understand the fearsome weight of it. It was a fulcrum thing, it was a pin, a pivot. It shifted, tilted, but truthfully it only seemed to turn. In truth it stayed. In truth the whole world spun. One final weighty tip, and now the space left by the missing tooth was turned straight down. And as the edges of the gear gripped hard into the stone, Auri felt the whole world jar around her. It ticked, clicked, fit, fixed. Trembling, she looked around and saw that everything was fine. Her bed was just her bed. All of everything in Mantle, fine. Nothing was nothing else. Nothing was anything it shouldn't be. Auri sat down hard upon the floor. So full of sweet relief, she gasped. She laughed and gathered up the gear and held it to her chest. She kissed it. She closed her eyes and wept. All to her desire. Setting Fulcrum back upon its narrow ledge, Auri wiped her smudgy tears away from his sweet brazen face. Then she walked over to the kettle and was pleased to see the tallow was all melted. It smelled hot, of hearth, of earth, of breath. She bent and puffed the yellow flame away. Then to her basin. Auri rinsed her face. She rinsed her hands and feet. She sat herself beside the kettle on the warm stone floor. Soon now. Close. She grinned, and for the space of one long breath she almost didn't mind how tangled hair and smudged she had become. Auri stirred the tallow with a slender stick. She drew a calming breath. She took the jar of cinder wash and poured it slowly in among the tallow. The mix went cloudy all at once, white tinged with just a hint of pink. She grinned her proudest grin and stirred again. She gathered up the amber bine, all prickling quick and petal kind. She poured it in the kettle too, and all the room was filled with musk and mystery and bear. She stirred, and Silas filled the air. Her face intent, once more she stirred, once more. She felt the mix grow thick. She stopped and set aside the stir. She took a breath and let it out. She went and rinsed her face and hands and feet. 2 by 2 she gathered up her tools and took them back where they belonged. Back to tree and port and clinks she carried bottles, lamps and pipes. When all of this was done, Auri took the now cool copper pot and carried it. She tipped the kettle, reached inside, and lifted out a smooth, curved dome of pale, sweet soap. She used the flat edge of the petal plate to slice the dome of soap. She cut it into cakes, each one a different size, a different shape, each to each and all to her desire. It felt wicked and delicious, but given that the soap was hers, this tiny willfulness could do no harm. She indulged herself from time to time. It helped remind her she was totally free. As she worked, Auri saw the soap was not true white. It was the palest pink, the color of fresh cream with just a single drop of blood. Auri lifted up a cake and, moving over, she brought it to her face and touched it lightly with her tongue. She grinned at its perfection. It was kissing soap, soft but firm, mysterious but sweet. There was nothing like it in all Temerant, nothing below the earth or underneath the sky. Auri couldn't wait a moment. She skipped off to her basin, she washed her face and hands and feet. She laughed so sweet and loud and long it sounded like a bell, a harp, a song. She went to Clinks. She washed herself. She brushed her hair. She laughed and left. She hurried home. She went to bed, and all alone, she smiled and slept. The graceful way to move. The 6th day, Auri woke, her name unfurling like a flower in her heart. Foxen felt it too and fairly burst with light when she first wetted him. It was a waxing day, a day for making. She laughed at that before she even left her bed. The day had come too late, but she could hardly care. Her soap was sweet as any ever was. Besides, there was a dignity to doing things in your own time. But that thought sobered her somewhat. His visit would not wait. He would be here soon, tomorrow, and she still had nothing good enough to share. She had no perfect gift to give. There were 3 ways out of Mantle. But no. She washed her face and hands and feet. She brushed her hair until it was a golden cloud. She took a drink and donned her favorite dress. She didn't dally. Today was going to be a busy day. First came the disposition of her new and perfect soap. She had made 7 cakes. One was by her basin, sacred mantle. One she'd washed with yesterday in Clinks. The largest 4 she carried off to bakery to cure. The smallest, sweetest one she tucked into the bottom of her cedar box, so she would never have to go without again. That was a lesson firmly learned. Oh yeah. She paused, one hand inside her cedar box. Would he like a cake of kissing soup? It was quite fine. He never would have seen its like before. But no, she flushed before she'd even finished thinking it. It would be altogether too improper. Besides, it was not right for him. The mysteries might fit, but he had much of both about him. Willow, too, he was absolutely not a serious sort. She shut the lid of her sweet cedar box. Then to her feet, Auri felt the room go bright and tip around. Staggering, she took 2 steps and sat down on the bed before she fell. She felt the fear rise up in her. Her eyes darted round the room. Was this? No. This was a simpler thing. Her stomach was an empty drum again. She had forgotten to tend herself. So when her head stopped spinning, it was off to tree, but on a whim for company, she brought along brash Fulcrum. He had seen so little of the underthing, and heavy as he was, it really was the least she could do for all his help. Hams were nearly all the fruit the tree could offer up, but only nearly. She brought out a tin pot and filled it with fresh water. She lit the spirit lamp with her penultimate match. Then she climbed onto the counter and reached with both hands to fetch down her jar. The dried peas rolled inside, tinkling playfully against the glass. She worked the bailing top and poured peas into her tiny hand until they filled her cupped palm. Her hand was not very large. It was not so very many peas, but it was half of what she had. She tipped them into the pot, where they plinked into the warming water. Then, after a moment's hesitation, Auri shrugged and poured the other half into the pot. She set the empty bottle on the countertop and looked around. The burner's flicker light and Foxen's green-blue glow both showed the bareness of the shelves. She sighed and put it from her mind. Today there would be soup. Tomorrow he would visit. And after that, she would do her best. That was the only way. You did not want things for yourself. That made you small. That kept you safe. That meant you could move smoothly through the world without upsetting every apple cart you came across. And if you were careful, if you were a proper part of things, then you could help. You mended what was cracked. You tended to the things you found askew, and you trusted that the world in turn would brush you up against the chance to eat. It was the only graceful way to move. All else was vanity and pride. Could she bring honeycomb to share with him tomorrow? It was the loveliest of things. He had too little sweetness in his life. That was the truth. She thought of this while boiling bubbles danced her peas about the pot. Auri idly stroked brash Fulcrum's face, and after a long while of musing, she decided yes, the honeycomb might work if nothing else presented. She stirred the soup a bit and added salt. She wished the butter wasn't full of knives. A little fat in this would be a true delight. A little fat would suit it to a T. After her lovely soup, Auri headed back to Mantle. With Fulcrum keeping company, she could hardly make her way through vaults or Venerate. So she took the long way round and went by way of Pickering instead. Belly warm and with a guest besides, she took her time along the close-fit square stone tunnels. She was nearly back to Darkmoon, Fulcrum heavy in her arms, when she felt a gentle crickling underfoot and stopped. Looking down, she saw a scattering of leaves on the floor. It didn't make a bit of sense to find them here. There was no wind in Pickering, no water here. She looked around and couldn't see a speck of a bird dropping. She sniffed the air. Couldn't smell a tree or bird. But there was nothing threatening either. Nothing knotted up about the place. No skew or wrongness here. down upon the floor and lifted up the lid. It looked familiar. She hunted round and found a handful of them scattered near an open doorway. She picked these up, and when they wrangled up together in her hand, she understood. Excited, she took Fulcrum back to Mantle. Before she left, she kissed his face and set him comfortably to right on the stony ledge, gap down, of course. Then she skipped to port and lifted up the silver bowl. She held the crickling leaf she carried up against the twining leaves engraved around the edge. It was the same. She shook her head, unsure of what they might portend. Still, there was only one way to tell. Taking up the silver bowl, Auri scurried back to Pickering, then through the doorway where she'd found the clustered leaves, over a stone tumble, around a fallen beam. She did not know if she had ever been to this piece of Pickering before, but it was still simplicity itself to find her way. Here and there a leaf or two would dot the floor like breadcrumbs. Finally, she came to the bottom of a narrow shaft that led straight up. An ancient chimney from the days before. A tunnel for escape. A well. It was narrow and steep, but Auri was a tiny thing. And even carrying the silver bowl, she climbed it quickly as a squirrel. At the top, she found a plank of wood already partially askew. She pushed it easily aside and clambered out into a basement room. The room was dusty and disused, full of shelves, barrels stacked on corners, shelves jammed full with bundles, kegs, and crates. In among the smell of dust, she caught a whiff of street and sweat and grass. Looking round, she saw a window high up in the wall, and on the floor below, some broken glass. It was a tidy place, save for a scattering of leaves blown down in some forgotten storm. There were sacks of corn and barley flour, winter apples, waxed packages stuffed tight with figs and dates. Auri walked around the room, her hands behind her back. She stepped lightly as a dancer on a drum. Kegs of molasses, jars of strawberry preserve. Some squash had tumbled from their burlap bundle just beside the door. She shooed them back inside and pulled the drawstring tight. Eventually, she bent to look more closely at a lower shelf. A single leaf had come to rest atop a small clay crock. Moving carefully, she lifted up the leaf, removed the crock, and put the silver bowl down in its place. She lay the leaf back down inside the bowl. She allowed herself a single longing look around the room, no more. Then Auri headed back the way she came. Only back in the familiar dark of Pickering did she draw an easy breath. Then eagerly she brushed the dust from her new treasure. If the picture was to be believed, the crock held olives. They were lovely. The olives went to tree. They looked a little lonely on their shelf, but lonely was alongside better than naught but empty, echoed, salt and butter full of knives. Better by a long row. Next, she checked on things in port. The ice blue bottle wasn't entirely at home. It huddled on the lowest, leftist shelf upon the eastern wall. Auri touched it gently, doing her best to reassure. He liked bottles. Might this be a seemly gift? She picked it up and turned it in her hands. But no, not this bottle. Grave, graven, not named for someone else. Maybe some other bottle. That felt nearly right. Not quite, but she thought about the vanity in tumble. Yesterday it had seemed squared and true, but she was more than slightly tattered. Not at her best. Perhaps there was a bottle mixed among the rest, something wrong, lost, or out of place. If nothing else, it was a place to start. So Auri gathered up the warm, sweet weight of Fulcrum in her arms, and because he hadn't seen them yet, she took the slightly longer way through Van and Forth and Lucius before she headed down to Wayne's. She paused to rest in her new and perfect circle of space. Fulcrum settled like a king upon the velvet chair, while Auri lounged upon the fainting couch and let her arms recover from the sweet ache of holding him. But she was too busy for long lounging, so Alice gathered up the heavy gear again and made her slow way up the unnamed stair, taking her time so Fulcrum could marvel at the odd and cunning coyness of the place. And as the two of them were gentlefolk, they both ignored the bashful door that sat upon the landing. Then into Tumbrel. Climbing through the wall, Paoli saw the room was just as she remembered. Not perfect true like Amulet, but nothing glaringly unskew. Nothing askant or lost or outmirrored. Now that the vanity was squared away, Tumbrel seemed content to rumble down into the warm winter sleep. Even so, she'd come all this way. So she opened up the wardrobe and peered inside. She touched the chamber pot. She looked into the closet too, nodding politely to the broom and bucket there. Auri eyed the vanity. There were a few fine bottles there. One especially caught her eye. It was small and pale, coruscant like opal, perfect with a cunning clasp. She didn't have to open it to see that there was breath inside. A precious thing. She lifted Fulcrum higher and tried peering through the round hole in the very center of his oh-so-centeredness. She hoped to notice something she had missed before, something loose or ravelity, some thread that she could tug to jostle something free. But no. Whether she looked straight or slant, the vanity was well and truly set to rights. A bottle coruscant with hidden breath would be a princely gift. But no, taking it was every bit as stupid and unkind as wrenching out a tooth so she could carve a bead from it and thread it on a string. She sighed and left. Out through the wall, then down the unnamed stair. Perhaps she could go hunting down in Lynn. It was a piping place and music. It was then. Heading down, a sly stone turned beneath her foot. As Auri made her musing way from Tumbrel down the unnamed stair, a stone step tipped and pitched, her forward, lurching. Auri gave a cry, and in her sudden startle, Fulcrum leapt away. He spun and tumbled from her arms and sailed out from the cloud of her gold hair. Heavy as he was, he almost seemed to float rather than fall. He turned, toppled, and struck the seventh stair so hard he cracked the stone and bounded back into the air, then spun again, fell flat upon his brazen face, and shattered on the landing. The sound he made was like the keening of a broken bell. The sound was like a dying harp, bright pieces scattered when he struck the stone. Auri somehow kept her feet. She didn't fall, but oh, her heart went icy in her chest. She sat down hard upon the steps, too numb to walk. Her heart was cold and white as chalk. She could still feel him in her hands. She saw the lines of his sharp edges kissed into her skin. Coming to her feet, she shuffled stiffly down the stairs. Her steps were numb and stumbling as more thoughtless stepstones tried to trip her like a daft old man who won't stop telling an unfunny joke yet and again. She knew. She should have moved more gently with the world. She knew the way of things. She knew if you weren't always stepping lightly as a bird, the whole world came apart to crush you. Like a house of cards, like a bottle against stones, like a wrist pinned hard beneath a hand with the hot breath smell of want and wine. All brittle stiff, Auri came to stand upon the bottom stair. Her eyes were down and all around her hung her sunny hair. This was the worst of wrong. She could not bring herself to look beyond her tiny dust-smudged feet. There was nothing else to do. She lifted up her eyes and peered, then peeked. Then she saw the pieces and her heart went sideways in her chest. No, not shattered. Broken. He had broken. Slowly Auri's face broke too. It broke into a grin so wide you'd think she ate the moon. Oh yes, Fulcrum Horses break, waves break, of course he broke. How else could someone so all-certain-centered let his perfect answers out into the world? Some things were just too true to stay. Fulcrum lay in 3 bright pieces, 3 jagged shapes with 3 teeth each, no longer a pin stuck hard into the heart of things. He had become 3 threes. If anything, her grin grew wider then. Oh, of course. It wasn't something she was looking for. No wonder all her searching was for naught. No wonder everything was canted wrong. It was 3 things. He was bringing 3, and so must she. 3 perfect threes would be her gift for him. Auri's brow furrowed and she turned to look back up the stairs. The gear had struck the 7th step. Fulcrum had scattered it quite lately. Another thing she did. He wasn't coming on the 7th day. He would visit her today. Some other time that knowing might have sent her spinning badly out of true. It would have set her all a-sweat and tangled beyond all hope. But not today. Not with the truth so sweetly set before her. Not with everything so sudden plain for her to see. 3 things was easy, if you knew the way of it. Auri was so whelmed it took her several minutes before she realized where she was standing, or rather, she realized that the stairway finally knew where it was. Knew what it was, where it belonged. It had a name. She was in Ninewise.
For reference, chapter 11 now. And that's it for the morning. Bye bye. See you.